Good evening. Welcome to the Lake Oswego Planning Commission meeting of September 23rd. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Iris, would you please call the roll?
Baker,
Here.
Beckett,
Here.
Fisher,
Here.
Hanson,
Here.
Heap is excused, Pepe,
Here.
Ward.
Here.
Thank you. And a council update. Councilor Windland, would you like to give us an update?
Sure.
Thank you.
Happy to do that. Good evening, Chair Baker and fellow commissioners. You came out on a nice night tonight. I think we have limited sunshine, so thank you for being here. There's not a lot to report from the City Council meeting. There's a few things that I did want to review. First of all, I wanted to thank, I saw several of you at the reception that we had down at Foothills Park for our new city manager, superintendent, and editor of the review. And we had, I don't know, kind of about, I think 60 people kind of came and went during the time frame, and it was great. It was good to get everybody that is a wonderful leader and contributor to this city kind of in one place, and we hope to do that more often so we can kind of get the fusion sort of the old fusion. I don't know if you have been around long enough to know what the fusion project was, but to try to get all of our city leaders in a room or in a space in a casual environment so we can mingle and talk and kind of get caught up and work as a community. So that was a good event, and it didn't rain. It stopped raining for the afternoon, so all was good. A couple of the things that from the last City Council meeting, it was mostly a study session. It was actually a fairly short meeting. We were only actually met for about 2 hours, so that was a fairly short council meeting. But we did talk about the refinement of the home demolition tax proposal, and Director Siegel brought a couple of different, well, as usual, is a very thorough report on different options and different things that we can do, pointing out pluses and minuses. We're really at the discussion stage. Nothing was really, we did give some direction to keep it simple. The idea is that we're trying to recoup maybe some SDC charges that we have when they go to do a demolition of a older house in Lake Oswego. SDC charges were never collected back then, since system development charges are fairly new within the last, 30 or 40 years. So essentially what our idea is that system development charges obviously help with capital projects such as parks and different things. So the idea is that we would allocate that demolition tax to the park and recreation maintenance budget to help offset the rising costs of taking care of our over 600 acres of parks and rec. It's not done yet. It hasn't been completely baked, but there is talk between a $15,000 and a $25,000 tax when somebody goes in, a homeowner, a developer that takes down a house and levels it, and that person would not be paying SDC charges. So it would be recouping some of that money. So at this point, it hasn't even, there's not been a consensus whether everyone's approving of it, but there does seem to be a general sense of consensus that we need to talk further about it and have some more discussion. So that's kind of what's happening on that one. And then there was actually an almost attempt to talk about the riparian lands tax incentive program, which was really a program that we were partnering with the county to maybe give some relief to homeowners who are trying to keep their what would you call it, their natural habitat yards from keeping them in natural habitat. And it turns out that the county just doesn't have the support mechanism, so we passed on really talking about that, and it will probably be something in the distant future before we would talk about that again. And then we talked about prioritizing the Parks Bond projects, and there was consensus with the council that we would recommend taking some of the first items on the list, which would be the Adult Community Center, Tennis Center, some capital maintenance projects that need to be happening with some of our parks, upgrading restrooms and different facility issues, maintenance issues that we've had. So we generally were in consensus that we would support the beginning $5 to $6 million of projects, and then hold off until we have more information on a number of other things on the list. So there's no compelling reason that we have to spend all the money immediately. We want to do it strategically. We want to do it efficiently. We want to do it in a cost-effective manner. So that's kind of the, again, this is a discussion, but we haven't taken action on any of those items yet because it was a study session. But the consensus of the council was pretty much that we were, let's get the low-hanging fruit on the bond projects done. The other thing that helps is we do have some city money that will be partnered. As an example, in the Adult Community Center, there's actually some funding that they have that would go towards updating and remodeling the Adult Community Center. And then also with the Tennis Center, there's been some additional city funds that we can match. So, so it's kind of one of those hybrid projects that makes sense to move forward with. And that's pretty much it from the city council meeting. Any questions? I know you have something to say about the tax bill. It wouldn't
No,
be
we have
fun.
two commissioners who have questions. Commissioner Beckett?
Yes, questions on two things. Speak to the thought that the SDC charge for demolition is related to affordable housing. That's one point. And the other is that in the use of the bond funds, you didn't make any mention of a swimming pool.
Oh, correct. So with the affordable housing, that's still a possibility to talk about that. I believe there's consensus with most council to keep it simple if we're going to do it, and not put it into an affordable housing unless we come up with an alternative that is simple to execute and simple to understand. And that's, I think, something that at this point in time, we haven't seen something that's met that criteria yet. But it's not off the table, but it wasn't heavily discussed as having full participation or full support from the council. The other item, as far as the pool is concerned, there's some points in the calendar that we need to meet in order to fulfill the school district timeframe. And one of those things is that the school district has hired a architectural firm to give some schematics and some options on size of pool, locations of pool, and different things. And both the city and the school district are working together from a staff level to figure out some of those alternatives so that they can present it to the school board and the city council sometime in the November, December timeframe. That's the first trigger point, is the kind of the location where it might go. The other point is what kind of project do we really want to have, and if the city will be supporting a project or not. I think there is consensus on the city council that we should be participating in a pool contribution. How much that is, it goes anywhere from 0 to whatever. I mean, we've heard 30 million to 5 million to $150. So there's widespread, and we haven't gotten to that point yet. I think there's more information that needs to be fettered out, you might say, to find out what true costs are. People oftentimes have things in their minds that they want a large pool with a recreation center and all that kind of stuff, and then it gets into how much does it really cost? Do you have a space to put it on? And then how much does it cost to operate it? And I think that brings everybody to the table and pretty much brings us all to reality. And so there's been a lot of talk about the pool. We just aren't in a decision-making area where we have enough information to make a reasonable deliberate discussion or decision at this point. So that's kind of the status on the pool.
Thank you. And Commissioner Ward.
Thank you for informing us regarding all of those things, Counselor. I have just one quick observation and a couple of questions, two observations and questions. With regard to pool development, it might be useful to look at what they've done and are doing in Mountain Park, which has a very elaborate pool set up. And the Planning Commission visited that facility at one time. I don't know if you've seen it lately, but it's pretty impressive. And I think well done, well managed, and maybe the city could get some information from the Mountain Park Association regarding pools in the larger sense. Observation, I don't think the Parks and Rec will ever have enough money, and they keep sucking up as much as they can get and will continue to do that. They have a history of using tremendous amounts of money. By the way, you know that you and I live across the road, across Iron Mountain Road from Iron Mountain Park. There's been a plan to develop a park, a real developed park in Iron Mountain Park, beginning back in the mid-1980s. 35 years later, we still don't have a park there. There's been a much more recent plan that I've sat on a group with over the last, goodness knows, I don't know how far back this goes, if it goes 6 years or more, for a developed park within the undeveloped mountain park. Nothing's going on there except that they sprayed the blackberries last year. As you know, I mean, you're familiar with that location. And, so Parks and Rec is spending money hither and thither and elsewhere. And here's an area that is not well served by a park, that doesn't have a park. It's just bizarre to me how they prioritize their work, so.
An update on the park from the Parks and Rec director did say that it is a funded project, that they are soon to take part. They had some engineering issues or some environmental engineering issues with moving the
Springbrook, yeah.
Right, and so once that clears those hurdles, I think we'll see action on that. And I think there's a lot of frustration by a lot of people on why it hasn't occurred yet, and I think that's a valid concern. I agree with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor.
I'm off the hook now?
You're off the hook.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
You have an
Good report.
exciting agenda ahead of you. I shall leave you to that. Thank you.
You don't want to stay. Okay, the next item is item 4, citizen comment. I have one blue slip from Diane Cassidy. If you want to talk to us, please come up and talk to us.
I understand you're real strict with the time, so I better hurry. I'll talk fast. Good evening, Commission. I wanted to talk about the tree
You
code.
had to, for the record, can you
Oh.
give us your address?
Diane Cassidy, 3601 Wren Street. I want to talk about the tree code. I understand that the tree code is a municipal code and that the Planning Commission only deals with development code. My concern tonight is about the double standard that's being employed between the two codes. I'm the chair of a homeowners association of a condo in Lake Grove, and we had to cut down 3 trees this year. They were leaning, rotting, and pulling up asphalt, so that there was a big need to do so, but they were all native trees. There was 2 maples and a fir. And we were told, okay, you cut down native trees, you have to replace with native trees. And then I was handed a native tree mitigation list. Well, the list is sort of a joke, but that's for another discussion altogether. They're not necessarily even native to the Willamette Valley, but even if they were, there's a problem. Why are we requiring homeowners or anybody to put in native trees? It sounds like a good idea, but I have not been able to find the rationale for it anywhere. And if homeowners are being required to replace native for native, why is that not being required of all trees that are being cut down in commercial or other kinds of development circumstances? You're going to build a house, you're going to build I don't know, whatever, on a piece of land, and you need to cut down some trees. You have to fill out something for a permit, and for some of the permits, I mean, I don't know, I've talked to people who should know the code better than I, and it sounds like there's a lot of misunderstanding about what the code is, but the upshot is that houses are being built without native trees being replaced. And that's the kind of double standard that I see, and that I wonder if we have such a great need for, and if it's such a value to the city to have native trees being replaced with native trees. Why isn't what's good for the goose good for the gander? Why is the burden being placed on homeowners of established lots, but not on builders who are building new? Why can a builder put in maybe a lovely dogwood or an eastern red bud or something, a sangukaku, something that was really decorative or ornamental, but we would be stuck with another big leaf maple? I mean, there's not a lot of choices there. There's some scrubby willows or some things that are just plain icky, but, or too big, ponderosa pines. There's not a lot that's appropriate. So what we're gonna have to do now is pay $135 per tree just to avoid the whole problem altogether, which I think is extortion. But I would like to see parity between what is being done on the development side and what is being done on the tree code or municipal side.
Okay, thank you, Diane. So is it okay if staff takes a little time, maybe a couple of weeks, and looks into what you just brought up to our attention?
Sure, if there's a rationale for any of it, I'd love to hear.
Okay, and maybe we can get back to you with that rationale, but there's a commissioner has a question. Anybody? Not at this
We'd be happy to
time.
address it now. If
I
there's
do.
time.
Okay. Commissioner Ward?
I wonder if one of our planners who's present could address this issue.
Of course. So we do have a native tree replacement requirement if you're removing with a type 2 permit. So that's a tree that's over 6 inches in diameter, and you're removing it for development purposes. So are you all familiar with the type 2 tree removal process?
Well, no, because this planning commission is not
Doesn't
involved
involve in that, okay. All right, so just really quick background. Type 2 tree removal is for removal of a healthy tree that is not a hazard tree, not an invasive tree, not a type 1 tree, which you get a couple of those on your property per year if they're 15 inches in diameter or less. So a type 2 tree is what we would see for removal because it's breaking up a landscape planter or it's breaking up a driveway. It's in an area that's too crowded, or for development purposes, like if you were doing an addition on your home, a new home, commercial development, institutional development, whatever. If it's removed for development purposes, it's under the type 2 standards. The type 2 standards always require mitigation. It's 1-to-1. Unless it's a significant tree, and then it's a minimum of 2-to-1. And if you're removing a native tree, you have to replace it with a native tree. So if you take out a significant Doug fir, meaning it's, say, a 36-inch Doug fir right at the front property line, you would have to replace it with at least 2 native trees. And we would look at what is appropriate, like the native species from that list, what is appropriate given the leftover planting area, utility lines, proximity to the house, driveways, everything like that. So what Diane Cassidy has experienced with her tree removal, having to replace with a native, that is a requirement for all type 2. If you remove native, you have to replace with native.
So if I'm not mistaken, I don't want to speak for you, but I thought the question had more to do with the difference between developers and homeowners. And
Yes, there isn't one. A type 2
Okay.
is a type 2, and it applies no matter who is applying for the type 2 tree removal standard or tree removal application.
One of the frustrations that a lot of citizens have is that they see a lot that's being basic, I don't want to say clear cut, but where a substantial number of trees are cut down to make room for the development. And there are no postings, there aren't the signs put up, there aren't the kinds of things that you would see with a type 2 permit, so it doesn't appear to the locals as if there are those kinds of permit processes going on. It seems like it's a completely different world, and we don't know that there's permits, that there's checking up, and that there's follow-through or accountability, because this is not our world.
so Diane, are you looking for more answers? Or are you just expressing this issue?
Well, I guess I'm just whining.
That's okay.
Because it's a burden. It's a burden for everybody. And I don't understand the rationale for native trees especially off of this list. I don't know why we have to do that.
So maybe you could talk to one of our planners and get more information if they can help you. Maybe we
Okay.
can't help you.
Yeah, and
but
I'm going
we can-
to ask the city council the same reason, for a reason why does anybody in the city have to put in one tree as opposed to another? I mean, what is the good for the city
Sure.
as a whole?
Good questions. Thank you very much for
Okay.
bringing it to our attention.
And I'm sorry, I have to remind the commission that the tree code is not a land use regulation, as Ms.
I
Cassidy indicated.
understand that.
And therefore, it's
Well-
not really a matter for the commission to.
And that's why I was referencing the staff to look into it.
Well, from my mind, it seems like it is, because they seem to be they're completely different.
It is not.
It's
Okay.
not, and we won't be reporting back to the planning commission on this matter, but we
No,
will
okay.
address Ms. Cassidy's questions before the city council, should this come before the council.
Thank you. I have no other blue slips for citizen comments. So we'll move on to minutes. We only have one set of minutes. The agenda has 2, but one is ready. I think you all have it in front of you, August 12th, 2019. Is there a motion to accept the minutes? Or should we just
I
wait?
move we accept the minutes.
Second.
Thank you. It's been moved and seconded to accept the minutes for August 12th, 2019. Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, please say nay. The other minutes will come at a different meeting. Moving on to item 6, Commission for Citizen Involvement. I have one item, and maybe somebody else has more, but I have one item. I have a reminder here that the Old Town Neighborhood Association is inviting everybody to come to a meeting on Thursday, October 10th, 2019, at 7 p.m. in the Lakewood Center for the Arts. They have a special guest speaking that night. Anybody else have anything to input for citizen involvement? Thank you. Next item is a work session, and I believe that we're going to have a report on the work session. This has to do with Community Development Code Annual 2019 Amendments, work session number 2, and planner, and I'll murder your name because I'm terrible with names,
That's fine. Johanna Hastay.
Hastings. I was close, thank you. Would you please brief us on that?
Thank you. Good evening, Commissioners. Johanna Hastay, Senior Planner with Planning and Building Services. And as the Chair stated, I'm here tonight at our second work session for the 2019 Annual Code Amendments. I have about 17 maintenance amendments and 6 policy amendments that we'll talk about today. And apologies for the PowerPoint in advance. It's a lot of text, but once we get further into it, there's some pretty pictures for everyone to kind of alleviate or elevate the situation. So I do have one public comment to add to the record. It's from the Home Builders Association. The copy should be in front of you. It's in support of item number 19, which is looking at exempting steeply downsloped lots from the side yard setback plane, and we'll get to that in just a moment. So here is our schedule coming up. We're here on the 23rd right now at the second work session, coming back for a hearing on November 13th, adoption of findings on November 25th, and then a quick turnaround and public hearing at the City Council on December 17th. Findings adopted, I'm going to assume, at the beginning of 2020, the first meeting in January of 2020. Any questions about that schedule before I keep going? Okay. So I just wanted to quickly update you, just in case you were paying attention to the first work session. A couple of things have dropped off. This dropped off the list. The first one is staff was under the mistaken impression that the parallel parking dimensions for the LGBC and Foothills Mixed Use Zone was incorrect. It's not. I was reading the table incorrectly, so that one has already been fixed and taken care of. No longer need to talk about it. The next one is we were exploring an exemption for the retaining wall height that might be necessary for an access lane. An access lane can serve up to 3 lots. There was really minimal support on that amendment from the development community and from some neighborhood activists that we talked to. They seemed to feel that the minor variance option was a good path to increasing the maximum retaining wall height from 4 feet up to whatever was necessary. Typically, access lanes are part of a minor partition, so they could get that minor variance at the same time they got the minor partition. So we're not going to follow through with that one. The next one, we had some zone and structure design standards in the R6 zone that we were exploring. We're still moving forward on that one, slightly delayed due to workload. But that's under a separate LU, and that's LU 19-0038. And so we'll be coming back, hopefully, for another work session at the end of November. And then the last one was, there was discussion about neighborhood meeting notices, and really public notices in general, and wanting to add in not just property owners and neighborhood associations, but to look at residents as well. Trying to get a broader outreach to the community and go beyond just property owners. And we figured, in looking at that one, we decided that it better fit under the effort that we have right now, to review and update the citizen involvement guidelines. So that's been shifted over to that process. So any questions on that before I move on? Okay. Sure.
I have one, Commissioner Hanson.
On that retaining wall, so
Yes.
my notes have that the height was limited to only 4 feet, and it was proposed to go to 10 feet. So when you're saying there was no interest, that means it's going to stay at a 4-foot minimum, or?
Correct. You can always terrace and get additional, like, the access lane up further if you need to. Of course, that will eat into your building envelope, or you
Okay.
can get a minor variance to increase it to whatever height is necessary.
Great, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so diving in, I'm going to try to go through these as quickly as possible. I think the best thing for the commissioners, if you would, is follow along on attachment A, starting on page 1. Each item is on its own. We start at the top on each item, if that makes sense. So I'll call out the page numbers as we go. But the first one is the non-conforming structure replacement. This is for non-residential, really basic. There's an incorrect reference there to a time limit. For non-residential, it's just a 50% replacement cost. If the damage is more than 50% of the current cost of the structure, then you have to bring the entire thing into code. So this just removes that incorrect cross-reference.
So which page are you on now?
I'm sorry, I'm on page 1 of attachment A.
Attachment 1.
Attachment 1. Gotcha.
So what I'm going to do is just ask at the end of each brief introduction if the commission has any questions, and then move on.
Okay. So I have one question, Commissioner Ward.
I wonder if you can tell me what the time limit was?
So it doesn't, the time limit is still in place, but it only applies to residential, non-conforming residential structures.
But not to
And it's-
commercial or industrial?
Yeah, no.
Why not?
So there's residential and there's non-residential. Because so it used to be that it was a 50% replacement cost for everything. And then a number of years ago, we separated out residential from non-residential. The residential stayed the same with the residential changed, and we put in a time limit there. But the non-residential stayed with the 50% replacement cost.
Is that something that we should be looking at in this item?
No, because this item here, it only goes to, this is, if you look at the subsection 4B, the title of it, structures other than single-family or duplex dwellings, accessory structures, and historic landmarks. So this entire subsection 4B applies to non-residential, all of these non-residential uses listed out here. Or the title excludes the residential uses that are subject to the time limit. So this subsection only deals with non-residential.
There should not be a time limit on
No.
when they redevelop?
It doesn't matter, yeah, so, I'm sorry, no, there just shouldn't be a time limit. If the damage is more than 50% of the replacement cost of the structure as
Bring it up to
is,
current code.
you have to bring it up to current code, no matter how long ago the damage was done. We don't have a time limit on it. So
Why would we have a time limit on other uses?
that's just the way that the code was written. So right now, the only thing we're dealing with this maintenance item is taking out the incorrect time limit for non-residential structures. We're not looking at the time limit for residential structures.
I sort of don't get it, but okay.
So then we're correcting mistakes here as
Yes.
opposed to changing policies.
Exactly. This is
Thank
just this is just a correction. There's an incorrect code. These two, the 1 parentheses, 2 parentheses, there's an incorrect reference there to a time limit that actually does not exist. Any other questions before we move on?
Thank you.
Okay, so, oops. Moving on to page 2 of attachment A. House Bill 2001 became effective in August. And so this is going through our accessory dwelling unit standards and pulling out those which no longer apply. Basically, those that we no longer have the authority to enforce because of the state regulations. And that is the owner occupy requirement, that the owner has to be in one of the 2 units on the property. And then by interpretation, we're also removing our parking space requirement that the House bill also doesn't allow us to require 1 off-street parking space per dwelling unit, 1 for the primary and 1 for the accessory structure. So again, this is bringing our code into alignment with HB 2001.
So I have 2 commissioner questions. Commissioner Ward?
I take it that this is just procedural. This is
Correct.
just really informative here because the state regulation is causing this change to occur. This is just to notify us and subsequently others.
State regulation supersedes our local code, so it avoids confusion to somebody who would read the local code and think they would have to, it should do X and Y, and then we can't have that.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, it needs to be changed in our code, but we don't have any say about it. It's not like I can vote, oh, no, I don't want to do this.
No, but I am bringing it to your attention that we are pursuing this amendment.
Understood. Thank you.
And it is worth mentioning that there are other requirements of House Bill 2001 that we're required to address, but have a longer time frame for the city to implement. So we will be working with the Planning Commission and City Council on addressing those.
Yeah, one other, Commissioner Beckett?
Yes, I do have a quarrel with it. There are many streets in Lake Oswego that are simply too narrow for parking to be on the street. And it seems like very unfortunate that the state not allow us to provide the necessity of parking spots on the property in those cases. Otherwise, there is no safe place for the new resident to park their car once we go to duplexes and triplexes and so on. So is there any way out of this in those situations? Can the city then make an exception to the state rule where it's not safe for on-site parking to be required?
So I can speak to that briefly, and then maybe Planning Director Scott or Deputy City Attorney Boone can chime in. First of all, ADUs are only allowed on single-family detached, on lots with single-family detached homes. So when you're talking about duplexes, triplexes, quads, we wouldn't allow ADUs there. So separate discussion. And then I believe the point behind this change in the House bill that's affecting us is that the market will decide, property owners will decide how to manage parking, and that we don't need to require parking. That's kind of the direction for a lot of jurisdiction now, is they're re-examining their parking requirements, for better or for worse. You know, everyone's going to have an opinion on that. But in this case, people do like having off-street parking spaces. Most homes have garages and driveways leading to them. So I'm going to assume, you know, through my own professional lens, that the point was let the market decide when and where that parking space for that ADU is provided.
Yeah, and, you know, we're not coming to the defense of the legislature on this. We're just trying to follow the law. But I will mention that on the other provisions of the now statute requiring that cities allow in area zoned for single-family housing, allow duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and cottage clusters. Those types of housing are not subject to the same, or we're not subject to the same preemption on having a parking requirement
correct, yeah.
that we are for accessory dwelling units. So when we come to that, we will be talking about parking, we will be talking about other reasonable siting and design standards for that middle housing.
And my final comment would be that if parking is unsafe on a street, then the city engineer has the authority to indicate no parking on the street.
That's right.
That would be regardless, of course, of who the occupants, you know, are of the dwellings. So some residences may have 3 or 4 cars, some may have 1, and an ADU may have 1, so they only have 2 total type thing. Doesn't really make a difference, but again, the city engineer, if it's a safety issue, then that issue could be brought to the city engineer and designated restricted parking.
Thank you very much. Please continue.
Oops, I keep doing that. So item number 3 is on page 4 of attachment A. This is regarding the special street setback and how required yards are measured. There was an inadvertent code removal. There was some language removed, I believe in the 2012 code reorganization, that in the special street setback standards, and then also under the definition of yard required, basically we're trying to rebuild back in a connection that a required yard is measured from the special street setback, whatever that is on a property. So if you have a property line abutting a frontage, and that special street setback would take up some of that yard, your required yard is measured from that point, not from the property line. So, sorry, that's not super clear, but hopefully the text in front of you is clear. We're just putting back in what was accidentally removed in 2012, that connection between special street setbacks and required yard setbacks. So any questions?
Thank you.
Okay. So moving on to item 4. Oh, I'm just going to put that clicker down. Moving on to item 4, we're looking at the Lake Grove Village Center overlay. There is, under the Village Commons area and Village Gathering Places, some lighting standard here. It's a general standard for those 2 amenities. So we're proposing 2 amendments to that. First is to reference the sidewalk lighting that was put in place with the Boones Ferry Road project. So there's a link now to the sidewalk lighting theme there that was approved, and so that'll be used as a reference for lighting for the Village Commons area and the Village Gathering Places. And then the second one is the removal of the reference to dark sky lighting standards, since those don't exist. Any questions there?
Thank you.
Okay, now I can click. Item number 5 on page 6 of attachment A. This is still within the Lake Grove Village Center Overlay District. We're building in a reference to invasive tree removal where there wasn't one before. So right now, under the Park Street Front Standards, a certain size of tree within a certain proximity of the streets listed out here have to be retained. There are exemptions for dead trees and hazard trees, but not for invasive trees. And so we are similar to other areas of the LGVC code, which exempt invasive trees from retention or preservation. We're adding in invasives there. Any questions on that one?
No, thank you.
Okay. Moving on to item number 6 on page 7 of attachment A.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh.
I misspoke here. Commissioner Beckett?
Yes, as I understand it, the rules that apply to individual existing homeowners against removing of trees without permission or of certain diameter, breast height and so on, don't apply if a developer comes in to strip down a house, clear the lot, and put in a new house. And I don't see anything in the provision here that distinguishes between that total lot redevelopment versus the freedom of against the homeowner simply changing their landscape.
I'm not sure how to respond to that, since we're not talking about the tree code with these code amendments. That's a non-CDC standard. This is a tree retention requirement in the overlay district, the Lake Grove overlay district. So there's certain streets called out here where if you have a tree that's over 8 inches in diameter, that's not dead or hazardous, you have to retain it, unless it's required to be removed to deal with the new sidewalks that are going in. In this case, these are it's primarily a commercial zone, commercially zoned district. They're always subject to tree removal and preservation standards. It's actually even more strict in the overlay district as far as what needs to be, or how you look at tree preservation and how you look at mitigation. So I think I worked on the Springs Living project and also the Mercantile project, and talking to those developers, they will tell you Springs Living has over 400 trees that they're planting on the site, a lot of them native. Mercantile has about 375. So I think Mercantile did clear cut their site pretty much, most of their site. Most of them were really badly suppressed landscape trees. Half of them were invasive. They were Norway maples. The Springs Living that had already been cleared in the mid-'80s for a development that never actually moved forward, so there really wasn't much. There was tree removal along the perimeter of the property, but it was mostly because of the public sidewalk. So all public projects, if there's tree removal, we look at it as clearly and consistently as possible. So I'm not sure how else to answer that question. I'm not sure if I answered that question or not.
We okay?
Yeah, I guess I am curious as to whether on those commercial projects that you're referring to, if the tree retention applies to those.
I would say that the point of that there is definitely a very strong preference in this overlay district to try and preserve significant trees. There is minimum landscape areas. We try to make sure that those are built around existing trees and to preserve them as much as possible. But this is commercial redevelopment. A lot of times what you're dealing with are smaller commercial buildings with small parking lots and people coming back in and rebuilding according to code, the development size according to code. That does make tree preservation more challenging. But again, I think, I think it's kind of a balancing act. From the development community, you'll hear, you want us to preserve too many trees, it's almost impossible to develop. And then from the broader community, you'll hear, the city is allowing the clear cut of all of these properties. So, I mean, just again, speaking from my perspective as a planner for the city over 15 years, I think we're kind of somewhere in the middle there, typically.
Well, right outside the window here, the whole string of trees right on 4th here next to this building are tagged for removal.
That's correct.
Because of course this building's going to be torn down, but does that mean the trees have to be removed?
So that was actually my project as well. The trees are being removed because we're upgrading the sidewalks. Right now, these street trees, they're doing okay, but they're in really small tree planters. I call them tree coffins. To upgrade the sidewalk to comply with current code, it would be impossible to preserve them. And so it was are the recommendation from the city's consulting arborist, Morgan Holland, that they be removed.
I think the point is, I mean, there was a land use hearing on this thing.
There
That
was.
was an issue, criteria were applied, the DRC heard the criteria, heard the evidence, and made a decision on it, so.
Thank you. Please continue.
So item number 6 is looking at street connectivity. The purpose and intent, there is a intent statement there to comply with some metro plans. We're simply updating them to be the correct plan references. Any questions on that one? Okay. Item number 7, and I'm on page 8 of attachment A now. This one looks really big, but it's actually just reformatting and adding back in a lost, an inadvertently lost cross-reference there. So to break it down for you, under the stricken through, a little I, you have, what we've done is we've turned that into 3 different subsections. So a little I became I, 2 little I, and 3 little I, if that makes sense. So it's applicable, the lighting standard is applicable to all major and minor development that results in increased use of public and private streets, public pathways, access ways, or open-air parking lot lights. So if you have a change in use coming in that requires more parking on the site, and you have to put in more lighting to go with that parking, this standard would apply. The thing that was lost is a 2 little I, which is back in the code reorg in 2012, there was somehow a link to just an alteration of an open-air parking lot. That link was broken. So somebody could come in and change out all of their light fixtures and poles and not be subject to any sort of land use review, not be subject to this lighting standard, which is that's not the right path. We want to make sure all open-air parking lot lighting is subject to minimum, maximum, and average illumination standards. So a 2 little I clarifies that for any alteration, addition, removal, expansion, whatever, of an open-air parking lot lighting fixture or pole would be captured and reviewed under this lighting standard. And then a 3 little I is just this whole last bit about the PF and PNA zones. Again, any alteration, removal, expansion, whatever, of lighting, open-air parking lot lighting in the PF and PNA zones, that it's captured under the lighting standard as well. So really the only change to the actual substance of the code is making sure that the open-air parking lot lights that aren't coming about because of a change in use or a DR project or anything like that, that they would also be reviewed under the land use rules and regulations. And then the last thing that we did is our new code format. We pull out exemptions really clearly. Right now it's just buried in 2 little I, or a 2 little I. So now we have it bolded, exception, and then when the sliding standard specifically does not apply. So hopefully that's fairly clear, but of course I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yes, we have one question right now. Commissioner Ward?
Quick question. Would it be well or helpful to add at that last portion regarding the exemption for temporary lighting? Nah, probably not. I think you've got it. Never mind.
Okay, yeah, that's just existing language, but if we can clarify, you don't see any need to clarify it?
I see a word in here that I was looking to put in a different place, and I think you've got it in a fine location, beginning with the sentence.
Okay,
Because we want to be sure that these are temporary events, and that's what it says. I was thinking temporary, but you were too. I appreciate that.
you're welcome.
Okay, we're ready to continue.
Okay, moving on to item 8 on page 9 of attachment A. This is again, just sort of clarifications to make sure that everyone understands who and when public notices are sent out. The first one in subsection 3A, we're just adding other jurisdictions into the title of this. It's not really necessary because affected roadway and railroad authorities does imply other jurisdictions, but the lack of that term there meant that some notices were missed. And so we're just being a little redundant and adding in other jurisdictions there so it catches people's eyes when they're looking at who and when to send out notice and who receives it. The second part in subsection 3C, there's no change to the actual substance of this language. We're simply wording it in a more reader-friendly way. and organizing it a little better. So this is just talking about when another jurisdiction would get notice, and that's for city and counties when the lot, the subject site, the subject lot is within a half mile of that boundary, say for the city of Durham, or when the site is within a half mile of one of those jurisdictions' transportation facility, like Highway 43. And then finally, the railroad company, if it's the only access to the site is providing, is over that railroad property. So again, no change to the actual substance of it. We're just trying to word it in a little bit more reader-friendly way. Any questions on that?
None, thank you.
Okay, moving on to item 9 on page 11. This one, I have 2 sections in here, and it's only the second one that's actually being modified. I put this one in because you can see under B, 2 little I, 4 and 5, it talks about how a land use decision by a staff level land use decision can be appealed by a recognized neighborhood association for no fee in subsection 4. And then in subsection 5, it talks about the process for a neighborhood association being able to file that appeal. And it's basically, you have to show that there was a vote, and you have to document that there was a vote to file the appeal. It can't just be a person from the board filing it on their own behalf. They have to show that the board actually voted on it.
So as a matter of curiosity, who pays the fee?
No one.
So the state
It's
allows
waived.
us to move on without paying a fee, or did I miss something?
That is correct. I don't know that we've ever checked back with the state code to make sure it was copacetic with them.
Sorry, what was the I was thinking about, first of all, I think the actual code provision says that it has to be approved by the neighborhood association according with their bylaws or something like that.
Yes, I'm sorry, I was paraphrasing in here. It says it very clear under 5 what the parameters are for the neighborhood association being able to file a free appeal.
Right.
Or-
Point is that each neighborhood association has to decide, perhaps in their bylaws, what their process is for making such a decision. Some may have a land use committee that would be authorized to do so. Some may have a subcommittee of the board. Some may require a full board. We're not trying to determine that. We're just saying that however it's determined, we need verification that that decision is made in
Yes,
accordance
sorry.
with the bylaws.
It may or may not be a vote. Sorry.
Now, Mr. Chair, your question again, I'm sorry, I was listening to that.
Well, I was wondering, is this allows them to file an appeal to DLCD or only to the city council?
Sorry, okay, let me clarify. So this first one here, this talks about appeals of minor development decisions. Those are typically staff-level decisions, so me issuing an approval for a minor partition. So if someone didn't like that, if it was a board and they followed their bylaws and they documented that they were filing an appeal, then they could file an appeal of my decision to be heard at the Development Review Commission for free. So that's codified here in code, it's in our master fee schedule. What's not codified in our code, but it is in our master fee schedule, is the neighborhood association also gets an appeal fee waiver if it's a DRC decision to city council, or planning commission decision, I guess I should say. So any hearing body that makes a decision, the neighborhood association has the same appeal fee waiver. So
These-
what I'm adding back in on subsection C, and that's on page 12 of attachment A, is I'm just referencing back to this 4 parentheses, 5 parentheses, on how that they can get that appeal fee waived.
So I guess I was a little mistaken. It's an appeal to the city, one of the boards, or
If you go up to LUBA, then you're on your own. You get to
Yes,
pay all
okay.
of the costs associated with that.
and this isn't to imply that, so we're pretty comfortable that this is clear. We're not paying their fee to apply to,
No, not at all.
okay, good.
And this is codifying current practice too, so.
Thank you.
Okay,
Any other questions?
sorry, yeah, any other questions? All right, moving on to item 10, which starts on page 13 of attachment A. Oops, wrong way. Okay, so this one is a very, very simple one. It's a minor development classification that mistakenly had a very important word dropped, not. Basically, this is a minor development classification for school improvements that do not impact the neighborhood, do not have traffic impacts or anything like that. So back in 1992, somehow the not got dropped, and we're adding it back in. So if you're doing a school improvement project, like say reskinning the exterior of a building, that doesn't increase traffic, there's no negative neighborhood impacts, there's no new students coming to it. I mean, maybe parents will be more likely to bring their students or enroll their students in a pretty school versus a falling down school, but that's beside the point. That's a minor development classification. If you're doing any sort of school improvement project that does increase traffic impacts, like modular classrooms, which we've seen recently, or additions or gyms or anything like that, the stadium, the grandstand and stadium cover at Lake Ridge High School, then that is classified as major development and it's subject to a different set of standards. Well, same development standards, different procedure. It's a major development application. So I'm overcomplicating this. Basically, we're just adding a knot that was very mistakenly dropped. So hopefully that's clear. Any questions on that?
None, thank you.
Okay. Moving on to item 11. Back in 2018, there was an update to our flag lot standards and access standards to limit the number of flag lots on an access lane to 2, up to 2. When this language was written, we inadvertently limited the type of partition that can use the access lane. So it basically said only one non-flag lot. It states outright that only one non-flag lot can use the access lane. So we have a minor partition configuration. It's not common, but it still happens, of two front lots, a centrally located access lane serving a back flag lot. So it's 3, but it's kind of a U-shaped partition configuration. So in that scenario, under the current code, one of those flag lots would have to take access to the public street via a private driveway, which is the exact opposite of what this flag lot standard is trying to do, which is consolidate access points into public streets. So we've rewritten it basically to say the access lane can serve up to 3 lots, up to two of which can be flag lots. So you could have a 2-lot partition with 1 flag lot. You could have a 3-lot partition with 2 flag lots. You could have a 3-lot partition with 2 non-flag lots and 1 flag lot. Basically just makes it more flexible, and that is in keeping with the legislative intent of that 2018 code amendment. It was just written a little incorrectly. Any questions?
None, thank you.
Okay. So moving on to page 15 and item 12. This one, again, gets to clarifying the legislative intent. In 2017, we expanded the downtown redevelopment design district criteria. And what we wanted to do in that effort, and it wasn't absolutely 100% clear in the code, is to differentiate what standards apply when you're applying for different design variances. So again, this is only for a project in the downtown redevelopment design district. If you're applying for a design variance standard to a regulation in subsections 5, 6, or 7, and that's building design, site planning, and view protection, then you are subject to the DRD-specific design variance criteria. If your project includes a design variance to any other downtown redevelopment design district standard or any other code standard, and that's what's allowed in the DRD, then you're subject to the general design variance standards. So what we're doing is adding in just a quick reference here under the general design variance standard criteria that say these general design variance standards apply except if you're looking for design variance to subsections 5, 6, and 7. So trust me, it's clear for planners implementing it, but I'm not explaining it very clearly.
So you might recall, some of the commissioners may recall working on amendments to the design variance criteria that Johanna's describing. And this came from a city council goal where the council was interested in allowing more flexibility to building design specifically, so architectural styles, materials, detailing. And so that's really what the amendments to the variance criteria were for. And the structure of it left it somewhat ambiguous as to, if I'm applying for a variance to a parking standard or a landscaping standard in the downtown district, do I apply these downtown design district variance criteria, or do I go to this other set of criteria that?
Or both.
Or both, or, that apply more generally to other planning issues. And so that's why we're trying to make it, laser focused on variances to building design, building massing, view protection, which is essentially a building design issue or factor, that we're applying these building design variance criteria. So it actually makes the code clearer and, what is already a fairly complex code, it's just designating which path to go down depending on what part of the project you're asking for a variance on.
To Commissioner, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm just to clarify, so this actually came about with the City Hall project. When I was writing that staff report, I was referring back to the 3rd and B project, the event center over there. And in looking at that staff report, every single design variance, Deborah Andreatis, addressed both the general and DRD-specific design standards. And if you look at them, they're very repetitive. They're similar in most cases. The DRD-specific design variance standards add on reasons for design variance, such as like building sustainability or some sort of unique building function. But the criteria themselves that you have to meet are very similar. So when I was writing the city council staff report, I thought, well, this doesn't really make sense. So I went back to the legislative history and realized actually there was supposed to be a separation, 2 paths, depending on which regulation you were asking for a variance for. So that's a little history there. But let me answer your questions.
You asking us a question, or you want us?
I saw that you did, there was
Yes,
a
we do have
question.
questions.
Please, fire away.
Commissioner Pepe.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I had a question a couple.
Earlier
Oh, yeah.
iterations, you're finished. And Commissioner Ward.
I just wonder if we on the Planning Commission are familiar enough with, with these other code sections to really understand fully what is being discussed here. There are 3 other code sections that you refer to. And although I know you endeavored to explain it to us, I'm still not quite able to understand this.
Which part of it?
Well, you're splitting it up between the downtown, well, it's all of this applies to the downtown redevelopment district, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
You've got kind of a minor variance on the one hand, no?
No, there's only design variances. This is under the design variance standard.
Yes,
Period.
design variance.
Yes.
And,
So in the downtown development design district, you can ask for a variance for any standard within that overlay district, that design district, or any other standard with it throughout the code. That's how it's set up from the get-go. In contrast, the Westlake Grove overlay district, you can't ask for any design variances. You can't ask for any variances, period. Well, you could ask for a major variance, which is hardship-based, but there's no design variances in that overlay district. In the DRD, you can ask for a design variance to anything. But right now, the code, the way it's set up is you have general design variance standards, you have DRD-specific design variance standards, you have RID design variance standards, and going through that, you have to figure out which criteria apply to the design variance that you're looking at. So again, going back to the legislative intent, it's very clear there that there are DRD-specific design variance criteria, and that's in subsection 50.08.003.4. And those apply only if you're asking for a design variance for 3 subsections in the overlay district, in the design district. So if there is any regulation within those 3 subsections that you cannot comply with for whatever reason, you are subject to the DRD-specific design variance criteria. If you're asking for a design variance to any other regulation within the overlay district or anywhere else in the code, you're subject to the general design variance criteria. So that's all we're doing here, is basically clarifying what criteria apply when you're asking for a variance to a specific standard.
So should the staff report for the public hearing just explain why it's being presented in this way? That we have building design standards that have their own unique variance criteria, and we're pulling those out. We're amending the code to address those. It doesn't really, it's in the commentary. It explains why we're focusing on these and why we're organizing in this way. Would it be helpful to put it in the?
Would you want me to put the DRD standards in there?
Are you basically just creating the point at which the road forks?
Yes, I'm clarifying.
You either have to go
I'm not
down
even
A or
creating it, I'm
B.
clarifying which
But
path you take.
that is well said within the code. This is just trying to the attempt is to simplify it.
Clarify, because I mean, just because looking back at that third and B project,
Right.
it obviously wasn't clear to staff at that point which criteria apply, which path to take at that fork in the road. And so she reviewed both for all of them, and it's really redundant. If you look
Okay.
at the general design, they're general design variance criteria, and then you dig into the DRD ones, and they repeat a lot of the general ones, and then they have their own path. So it doesn't make sense to do the exact same analysis.
Yeah,
It's trying to direct
I can
traffic
get on board with
and
that.
Yeah.
avoid redundancy.
So the
Exactly.
only thing we're saving here is redundancy. We're really not doing anything else.
No, yeah, and sorry, and like, I know it's a little complicated because there's all these
No.
cross-references there, but this is really a maintenance item. It is just saying, okay, when you come to this fork in the road, thank you for that analogy, go right or left, depending on which regulation you're asking for. So in the City Hall staff report, I had a clump of variances that were general, because they were variances to regulations outside of subsections 5, 6, and 7. And then the next section of the staff report, they were DRD-specific design variants, because they were varying from those specific regulations.
I guess where it gets confusing for me is in the previous ones that we just talked through, up through 12, there was a lot of crossed outs, and we're putting this word in to take out these 7 words, so on and so
Yes.
forth. Here, it's just
We're
seems
just
a little.
adding.
It seems a little different.
Yeah.
And again, to what Commissioner Ward said, when we're identifying how it impacts the other 3, well, 50.05.004.5 through 7. How exactly does all that get impacted? So maybe, Director Siegel, what you were suggesting, I don't know if
So
that
it's-
takes us back to the before this, but if it helps clarify it as well, it might be prudent to add.
So it actually, if you look at this next subsection in there that talks about the DRD-specific design variance criteria, those subsections are again listed out. So subsection, so LOC 50.08.003.3, that's the reviewing authority shall only approve a design variance, blah, 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 blah. And it's saying, hey, we're putting in a cop here saying, go right for these specific standards. We're gonna refer you down to 50.08.03.4, and then you go down here and you're saying, these criteria apply when you're asking for a variance to these standards. So we're building in a cross-reference there that was missing before. We're building in a cross-reference in the general design variance, that in that sentence, to say, if you're asking for a variance for any of these regulations, stop now, move to subsection .4.
So are we clear with everybody? We're ready to go on. Thank you very
I
much.
think I should review these code sections.
Okay,
I think that would perhaps clarify
Oh.
it for me.
okay.
Tonight or later?
Probably not tonight.
Thank you.
All right, hopefully this next one is a little easier to understand. Moving on to page 16, item 13. Right now, the definition of floor area has an exclusion for what is counted in floor area, and it just says allowable projections. That's a little vague in my mind, so we're proposing to build in a cross-reference back to an earlier section of code, which actually lists out what are projections from buildings that could be excluded. So again, just trying to make it easier for people, rather than having to guess what allowable projection it is, they can go to a specific code section and see.
So this is just a reference.
That's all.
Any questions? Thank you. Next,
Okay.
please.
Moving on to item 14 on page 17. This one, so forgive me, item 14 and item 17 are tied together, so you can see that in the blue highlighted passage there. But this one, it's a two-parter. We're looking at lot coverage and then also, lot area and lot size, and then also lot coverage. And so basically what we're trying to do is just make it super clear that flag lots, when you're calculating lot coverage, you do not include the area in the access easement or flagpole. And that's all these are doing. And I can explain it in more detail if you'd like, but it's really very basic.
Do you have any questions?
Okay.
I think we all got it. Thank you very much.
No,
No, we don't?
No, okay,
Commissioner Ward?
fire away.
I still have a problem with gross acreage.
Oh, we're changing that too. That's item 17.
We're going to get to that.
Yes.
Okay,
Item
well,
17.
I see it here, and it doesn't have any,
Well, it's highlighted. Please see item
It says
17.
see item 17.
okay.
Yes. It just got too confusing to try and meld those
Do you want
together.
to do those together to make it simpler for everybody?
I can try to push them together. I have, it's specifically item 17 pulls out 4 references to acreage. So,
This will be
Or do you want to come get
yes,
that
and
when we get
this will be
there?
among them.
Let's just go on to number
Number
15.
15?
Well, 15 be easy.
Actually, no, it's not.
A lot of red, a lot of
Unfortunately.
red.
I thought it was easy.
No, 15 is not easy.
No. So right now, the LOC Chapter 50 does not have a definition for caliper inch or for DBH. I talked to Morgan Holen, our consulting arborist, and got some great definitions from her. Unfortunately, those have kind of unraveled. We're doing a cooperative effort, or not, I should say, what's the word I'm looking for?
Collaborative?
Not collaborative. Done at the same time, basically a non-CDC amendment to the tree code and to this code. We're trying to get, of course, the same definitions in place. So this is our first attempt. It's unraveled a bit. It'll be finalized for the public hearing, basically explaining how to measure caliper inch, and that's typically for replacement trees, and then how to measure DBH, which is typically for existing mature trees. So we refer to them throughout LOC Chapter 50, and I think it's good to have a
Only 5
definition in there,
places
and
in this,
we will get there. Any questions before we move on?
Yes.
Okay.
Did Morgan really make it this complicated?
I am not going to throw her under the bus. I think it's a complicated issue because you have different ways of measuring caliper inch depending on what the size of the tree is. If it's a nursery stock tree, if it's a tree that's
I am so
somewhere
familiar
else.
with this stuff.
Yeah.
With my building experience, I've done logging, I've measured trees and trees and trees, and we never had any nice, flexible little measure to measure the circumference of the tree. Now, I understand the formula, circumference divided by pi equals diameter. That's a lovely, rather precise way of achieving an accurate measurement of diameter, but the way, we're just not going to do this, by which I mean it's unnecessarily complicated, in my opinion. We pretty much understand what diameter at breast height is 4.5 feet off of the finished grade.
except if it splits below then, and then you have to measure it at the narrowest point of it.
And if the tree is 24 inches wide, it's like good to go. And the reality is, if you've seen tree permit applications, I'm sure, you've probably seen hundreds and hundreds of them. You know how crudely drawn they are, typically. I try to draw the things to scale and put the trees where they actually are. But I've seen other applications that are just so crude you don't even know what they're talking about, let alone did they go there and measure with a flexible measuring device
Yeah.
and then divide by 3.14159. That's just,
But
I don't think
unfortunately-
that's realistic to expect people to do.
It's not, I think that a layperson is going to be less proficient at it, but unfortunately, it's a really important qualification. First of all, it decides which type of permit you're going to fall under, type 1 or type 2. It decides whether or not a tree is significant. If it's over 15 inches, healthy and non-invasive, then it could be significant. So we need to know what the diameter is, and we need to give people at least some sort of guideline to go out into the field and attempt this. And again, developers or arborists aside, they understand this, but most of our tree permits are from single-family homeowners that aren't familiar with our tree code. And to not have some sort of definition in the code, even though the code is riddled with these terms, I think is a mistake. Because we're also seeing a lot of tree appeals because people are dickering over whether it's a 33-inch tree or a 37-inch tree, and where did you measure it and where did you not? And so, again, those are tree appeals, and that's not LOC Chapter 50. But I do see this if you're talking about a numerical measurement, having clear guides in the code on how to get that numerical measurement, so it's hopefully as consistent as possible, I think is a good thing. I can only see it as a good thing, even though it might be frustrating for someone to look at and say, why can't you just figure
I
this out.
also think that having two different methods of measuring caliper is unnecessarily complicated, where we're measuring in one case 6 inches off the ground and another 12 inches off the
I
ground.
can speak to that, because I've been in communication with Morgan.
That's part of
on
the
the
Morgan, I've worked with Morgan, and I very much respect her expertise.
I spoke with her today on the non-CDC side. That's the tree removal section, which has requirements for mitigation trees of certain caliper inches. Also, in the CDC, we have a certain number of requirements for caliper inches on trees. That confusion confused me initially, and what it really is you have to determine what is the required minimum caliper inch per the code. If the requirement is, let's say, 1.5 inches caliper tree.
The code, I understand the numbers on that side of it, but what I find to be unnecessarily complicated is the requirement for the person that's handling or planting the trees to take out their little milliner's measuring device and wrap it around the stem of the tree and, divide by 3.14159. It's like, really? People gonna do that?
Well, I guess I would, first of all, the code, both in the tree section, which you're not looking at, but in some of the Lake Grove and some other mitigation requirements, it requires a certain caliper inch, minimum caliper inch. So.
I know.
Okay, so we then have to define, how do you get to that? I mean, how do you measure? What is it?
How did we go through so many years without this complicated formula?
Well, these are also, we do have definitions in the tree code for caliper and
I think we
DVH. We're
probably
just
borrowed
updating them.
those.
Yeah. Well, they're not straight.
Is it the same?
No, but we applied them.
But we've
I think.
applied them,
Right.
yeah. And we've all
Is the
been trained
method
by
of
Morgan as
measurement in
well.
the tree code the same as what is proposed here?
No, but
Yeah,
we're
of course
attempting,
not.
we're gonna have the same definitions in the end.
Yes, they will be
But-
in the end.
right.
And I just want to, for my own frustration, just share with the commission, when it talks about the 6 inch and the 12 inch based upon whether or not the stem is 4 inches, at the 6 or the 12, what that really means is if the code requires a 1.5 inch caliper tree, okay, then 1.5 is less than 4 inches, so you measure it at 6 inches up. If the code required a 5 inch caliper tree, then you'd measure it at 12 inches up. So the 6 and the 12 is driven by the requirement, not based upon the physical size of a tree. Okay? The code thus tells you whether to measure at the 6 or the 12 inches of the height.
Which part of me, I'm going to be inserting myself in this discussion because there is actually no place in the code that requires a 5-inch caliper tree. You could, by conditioning authority, require a 5-inch caliper tree to be planted, but I'm not sure that this needs to be as fine-grained. So we don't need to see all of the sausage making here. We will come back with something that is hopefully reasonable, easy for a layperson to understand, and we'll see what you think on November.
But we have to calculate it
13th.
somehow. And so it is, and of course, it's not.
It's
not
that
proposed.
wide.
There are calipers, which take all that math out of it, okay? A caliper is an actual tool, it is not a caliper inch. I mean, a caliper inch is a thing. And it's 3.14, that's what staff uses. We're not gonna go to pi with a slide rule.
It goes a lot farther than 159. The next three
It goes
digits are
to-
265.
I found a website that goes to 1 million.
Sure,
and it goes
absolutely.
beyond
And
that.
it's not
We're not gonna
done.
do that. We're gonna use
It is-
3.14.
3.14 would be a little incremental help to drop a couple of those
Right,
digits.
we're just 3.14 and divide it by the circumference, and there you have it. And the circumference is by the flexible.
Divide that into the circumference.
So in the end of this discussion, in the end of this process of change, will we end up with two codes that say the same thing about
Yes.
caliber?
Absolutely. That is our ultimate goal. I hate having
All
inconsistent
comes back
code.
around.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Can we put
Commissioner
C,
Pape?
Commissioner Ward,
We what?
under there? Just take all this out and say, see Commissioner Ward?
Go. We'll put out your personal email address and
problem.
phone number, and they can ask you. Okay,
I would
moving on.
suggest that someone coming in for permission is going to be hard pressed to determine whether they just looked at it and said, oh, it's 24 inches, as opposed to taking a ruler and stretching it around it and dividing by pi. Who's going to notice?
Yeah, and honestly, that's what we end up doing when we're taking in permits. You know, nobody knows, and so we hold up our hands and we try to get a best guess. And with type 1 permits, we try to be as concise as possible because of course those are over-the-counter permits. With type 2, we do have people going out and verifying the trees, species, location, and we also verify size. And so we'll update our records in those scenarios. So again, if we have a numerical standard, we'd like to have clear ways to get to that number.
You know,
So,
and if we had, I'm gonna just insert my own philosophy. If we just said trees were measured based upon DBH, 4.5 feet up, just had one, that would be helpful, but I suppose not all trees are measurable that way. So therein lies the problem. You know, not even all I mean, some trees split out below the 4.5, so you have to deal with that issue, so. You look for you look for simplicity, but nature is not, so there
Right.
we are.
So should we move on, or should we take
I'm
a short
happy to.
break?
Or, yeah, we can take a break if people need.
Let's
We,
take a short
We actually
break.
just have a couple more maintenance ones. Maybe we could get through those and then take a break before we move on to policy.
No, let's take a 7.5-minute break.
Okay.
Yeah, divided by pi, that's 2 minutes.
We'll divide it by pi. If I can find some. Call the meeting back to order, please, and start again, not start again, but continue on number 16.
Okay. So this one, I'm going to hopefully not confuse everything. I have a couple of changes from what we're proposing here. We're on page 19 of attachment A, looking at item 16. Basically, all we're doing with this is trying to clarify the code that was written a couple years ago, or maybe even not that, a year ago. In implementing it, some questions have risen, so we're just trying to rearrange things, use acronyms instead of accessory dwelling unit. So I'm going to walk through these and stop me when you have questions, okay? So looking at the pre-application conference standards, when a pre-app is required, we added in for accessory dwelling units that an accessory dwelling unit that adds floor area to a lot, and then it has such as, and it lists up some scenarios there, requires to go through a pre-application conference. What I have right now is just saying that adds in floor area to a lot, but that's actually incorrect. It's also when you have an ADU in an accessory structure, either that's a new accessory structure, an accessory structure that's added onto, or an accessory structure that is converted. So let's say a garage. So what I'd like to do instead of what I have here is say a ministerial permit application for an accessory structure, or sorry, for an accessory dwelling unit.
So you lost me. Where are you?
Yes, I'm sorry. So it's not even 8. All right, so E subsection I, we're starting with right before that first ADU in parentheses, moving back to 4 accessory dwelling units.
Okay,
I'm going to say for an accessory dwelling unit, singular, parentheses ADU, that is not a conversion. And I'll explain what conversion is in a minute here. So that is not a conversion. You have to apply for a pre-application conference. And then second sentence, pre-application conferences must be scheduled by the applicant prior to submitting an application for development. So that's a minor or major development.
so let's go back.
Okay.
So that add,
Do you want me to read the full sentence as I'd like to
Yes.
have it? Okay, so a pre-application conference with the city manager is required for minor and major development permit applications, comma, and ministerial permit applications for an accessory dwelling unit, parentheses ADU, that is not a conversion, period.
okay, so you're crossing out floor area to the lot?
Yes, adds floor area to the lot, and then also such as an addition, blah, 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 blah.
Okay,
Second sentence, pre-application conferences must be scheduled by the applicant prior to submitting an application for development or prior to submitting for a building permit when the ADU, again, is not a conversion. Period.
and crossing out adds floor area?
Yes, adding floor area to a lot. So everything after ADU is crossed out, and instead we say is not a conversion. So the reason I like code that's really simple, and I like it when it also ties together. So moving down to the definition of ADU, what we have here, what we're adding in, and this is again just taking existing language from that definition and pulling it up top. It talks about what is a conversion and what is not. So we have a cross-reference here back to this pre-application conference. And then we have a conversion is a remodel of existing floor area in a primary structure, period. That's the only time. And that does include converting existing garage. So if you have a 700 square foot garage, you can convert part of that to an ADU. An ADU created by an addition to a primary structure is not considered conversion. An ADU in an accessory structure created by an addition or conversion of an existing floor area is also not considered a conversion. So again, what we've done is between the pre-application conference and the definition of ADU, we have clarified when a pre-app is required. And that is, it's always required unless you're converting existing floor area in a primary structure.
Point of clarification on that?
Sorry, one more time. Mhm.
Point of clarification on that second sentence.
In which section?
an ADU created by an addition to a primary structure is not considered a conversion,
Or conversion of existing floor areas. Yes,
right?
yes.
Primary structure meaning home? Correct?
I'm sorry, oh, so an ADU created by an addition to a primary structure is not
Is
considered.
not considered a
Right,
conversion.
because you are adding floor area to the lot. So the only time it's considered a conversion and the only time you get out of a pre-app is when you have existing floor area within your primary structure, existing floor area, that you are basically walling off and putting in a separate entrance to.
And a
That's it.
primary structure is defined in the code?
Yes, it
Okay.
is.
We have 3 questions.
Okay.
Okay.
Commissioner Ward?
Up at the top of the page, pre-application conference with the city manager. Now, I've been to several pre-application conferences. I've sat on both sides of the table, probably with you once or twice, or more. And the city manager has never been present at any of those meetings. So, and I know that the way it works is that pretty much all of you planners are regarded as representatives or appointees, but I think at some point it would be helpful to make that, the fact more clear that I'm not going to be sitting down with the city manager at a pre-application conference.
No, I agree. That's an interesting point. We can put that in 2020 to look
Well,
at that.
City manager is a defined term in the Community Development Code.
Oh.
That's city manager or designee, and so it's the appropriate designated staff member.
So that's in code,
That's the definition
but
of the code.
but it's not out in the open.
When we use terms in the code that are defined, that's out of the
Well,
open.
for lay folks who are looking at doing some kind of work, city manager or city manager's designee, for instance?
For lay folks, we have.
I agree.
For lay folks, we have handouts and we have forms. And that's generally what people who are not familiar with our process will go to. And those handouts explain that a pre-application conference is a meeting with staff from the departments that are responsible for reviewing development. And I think it's pretty clear, what that is. I agree. From my perspective as a planning director, every other place that I've worked, it delegates to the planning director or the community development director. Here it says the city manager. I don't go to the city manager and say, can we schedule a pre-application conference next week? I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. But this is just how our code is structured. It's the terminology that we use, and I don't think we really have any.
That's not our biggest problem.
It's not our biggest problem. Thank you.
Let's hope.
We don't have direction anyway to change it from the city manager.
And I take it you
Well, I
don't
always
get,
thought, at the first, I thought I was going to sit down with the city manager, just FYI.
do we get a lot of calls for asking to talk to the city
Point
manager
well
about this?
taken. Sometimes we do receive calls where the code has provisions for,
Like undergrounding
yeah,
utilities, except
underground
at the,
utilities. It's the city engineer or the city staff
Manager.
generally who review those, so it
but
does
it
come
refers
up.
to the city manager. And so Scott Lazenby would occasionally get calls
So
from
the-
people saying, I don't want to underground my utilities. And he's like, talk to planning.
So the solution would be you would have to go through the codes and say, or designee in 1,000 different places.
It already says that in one place. And, actually, as putting on a city manager hat, I think different city managers may have different philosophies or management styles where they would want some of these questions to come to them, where others would be delegated more routinely. So I think it's,
There's that, and there are instances in which it's the planning director who made a decision, and then that was changed organizationally to the city engineer to make the decision, and, by
Just have to
city
rewrite the
manager.
code 1,000
We don't
times.
have to worry about organizational flow charts.
yeah, that's where the buck stops there.
You okay?
We could cut way down on staff. Just have a planning director, a city manager, and a city engineer.
There you go.
Save a lot of money.
Maybe if
Had a
the
long
city still
time.
had like 2,000 people, that would work. but-
Yeah. Commissioner
So-
Beckett, you have some question?
Yes. Down in the paragraph under dwelling unit accessory, there's a sentence that confuses me, so it might confuse somebody else. It says an ADU in an accessory structure created by
Yeah.
addition or conversion of existing floor area is not considered a conversion.
And I'm already realizing that's missing a new accessory structure as well. So I'll have to rephrase that sentence. Is it confusing beyond that?
No, that sentence doesn't make sense to me, since it says it's a conversion of existing floor area, but is not a conversion.
Oh my gosh, okay. Or should it say remodel of existing floor area? Would that make more
Yeah,
sense?
that,
So you're in the third sentence of the red,
Right.
an ADU in an accessory structure created by an addition or conversion of an existing floor is not considered a
Sorry,
conversion?
yeah, no, I'm seeing that now. So I think remodel might cover it?
yes.
Okay.
So you would change it addition or remodel?
Yes, and I would also add in new accessory structure. I'm not sure how, I'd have to wordsmith that. But again, going back up to the legislative intent, which was anytime you had a pre-op that was, an ADU that was somehow in an accessory structure, it would always require a pre-op. Because those, with the reduced setbacks, would possibly have more impact on neighbors than a conversion of, or an addition to the primary structure.
Good catch.
It could just say establishment of an ADU in an accessory structure is not a conversion.
That might be the
We'll trust you to
simplest way.
reword that to fix it.
Establishment.
And Commissioner Pape,
I mean, that's a new one or a
did you get your question answered yet?
Same, yeah, with,
So we're okay. Any other questions on item 16?
So there's some other ones there, but
Yeah.
it's just acronyms being inserted, taking out the word detached when it says detached accessory structure, because an accessory structure is by definition detached. So that's all, and so we can move on from there.
Please do.
Okay. Item 17, last of the maintenance items, and now I'm on page 21 of attachment A. So this is getting to Commissioner Ward's request to remove the term acreage where it's possible. And so I did in 4 sections, including the ODPS standards, 2 places in the flag lot standards, and 1 in the definition of lot area or lot size that we've already talked about. Any questions?
Questions?
we're not gonna get into the measuring of each side and the,
By pie.
Please no.
Maybe at another meeting.
We've got lots and lots of fun stuff to think about coming
No
up.
questions
so-
on
the hearing.
17. We can move on to 18.
Okay,
We're not converting to metric anytime soon.
Darn.
okay. Policy items. We have 6 policy items. I'm going to talk about the first 5, and then Planning Director Siegel will talk about the 6th one, the valet tandem parking for commercial uses. Apologies, again, this first one, front yard setback plane projections got pretty messy. Not messy, it just kind of blew up once we started digging into it. So when we first came to the work session back in July, what I presented to you was a common staff problem of trying to explain to people what a dormer is. And so our attempt, like where we were going way back in July, was we just need to put in a definition of dormer and maybe some graphics to show people what that is. And so we came up with a definition, and it was a very strict definition. It said that the dormer had to be completely surrounded by roof, and it had to be stepped back from the top wall plate. It was a projecting roof form, and then we came up with some good graphics. And then we had a meeting with the Builders Advisory Group, and they said, whoa, that's a really strict definition of dormer. Have you thought about how that's gonna work out with some of your overlay districts and the required architectural styles? What about wall dormers? And a wall dormer is specifically a dormer that is at the face of the dormer is at the same plane with the wall below. So it's not stepped back, it's not fully enclosed in the roof. And we thought, okay, well, let's come up with another definition of dormer that allows wall dormers. And so we went there. And then we went even further and we came up with a third definition of dormer, which basically doesn't say anything. And then the Building Advisory Group, after an hour discussion, said, why are we even talking about definitions of dormers? What is the actual issue that you're trying to address? And we realized it was the front setback plane standards and the side yard setback plane standards, and it's really just the allowed projections in there. That was the issue that we kept running into. And a definition of dormer didn't get us to a clearer code that could be implemented. So we came up with yet a 4th option, and then yet a 5th option. So, Joy, what is ours? We're going to be going over all 5 of those options. So, again, I'm on page 23 of attachment A. I wanted to put in for your reference, if you wanted to look at it, attachment B is the actual code standards for the street front setback plane and this internal side yard setback plane. So you can see what that looks like. So mostly I'm going to focus here on the staff memo, but if you have questions, we can turn to attachment B. So the first 3 options that we looked at, and again, we're on page 23 of attachment A, that first definition of dormer that's really strict. And we've got 3 graphics here on this PowerPoint presentation that kind of show what the dormers would look like. This one is, they're all stepped in and fully enclosed in the roof. Shed dormer, gable dormer, overlapping gable dormer. Of course, like I said, that sets up a potential, because these are definitions and so they apply to the entire LOC Chapter 50, that sets up a possible conflict with architectural styles that the dormers, which are actually a pretty prominent form of these architectural styles. A lot of these overlay districts talk about secondary roof forms, complex roof forms, breaking it up, including dormers, some sort of smaller roof forms to get more a varied visual look. So we see a conflict there. The second definition, enclosed on 3 sides, you see some examples here of what we call a wall plane dormer, or sorry, a wall dormer. There's some gable ones where again, the face of the dormer is the same plane as the wall plane below. Same with this shed dormer here. So that's a little bit more flexible of a definition of dormer, but it still possibly conflicts with overlay standards. It also doesn't really get to the underlying issue, which is projections into the setback planes for residential structures. So then, again, like I said in my discussion with the Builders Advisory Group, they said, well, just write a definition of dormer where pretty much anything goes, which, of course, that's easy for the definition, but it doesn't address that underlying issue, which is when you have setback planes and there are projections allowed in them and they're called out as roof forms such as dormers or gable ends, we still have that issue of helping people understand what is a dormer and what is a gable end and how much of it is allowed to project, what part of it is allowed to project. So in my memo, I'm not sure how closely you read that, but the standards right now, we have multiple interpretations that we have to track and teach each new planner as they come in on how to implement that code when they're reviewing building permits, how to talk about it at the front counter when people come in with questions. And it can be pretty challenging, especially when we're not talking, even when we're talking to architects and designers and builders, honestly. And of course, it's even worse when we're talking to property owners. So the Builders Advisory Group said, look, the point is this standard tries to control massing as it appears from the street, when you're talking about the street front setback plane, or from the neighbors. The easiest thing to do is just take out all this talk about roof forms and dormers and gable ends and simply call them projections, meaning it doesn't matter what it is that's projecting into that plane as long as it meets the parameters of that projection. It can be, you can have one projection as long as it's 1/3 the width of the facade that it's projecting into, or you can have multiple projections as long as it's less, 1/2 or less the facade that you're getting into. They said it's easy to implement, it's easy to understand. The drawback to that is that it does make the code more flexible. It does loosen up that code from the original intent of when it was adopted. So that's one of the options. It is supported by the Builders Advisory Group. And honestly, it felt great to me because I like having simple code that doesn't lose its intent, its overall intent. But when I brought this option back to my planning staff, my fellow planners, they balked at that and they said, well, I'm not sure that that's the best direction to go. And so they went with option 5, which is basically it takes that first definition of dormer and incorporates it into these standards. So it would only apply under these standards. These standards are superseded by the overlay district, so it doesn't set up a code conflict. But it basically says, it explains what a dormer is. And it will provide better graphics with it. We'll provide supplemental graphics. We still have to work on that figure that shows how you measure overlapping gable dormers and things like that. There's some scenarios that we think some illustrations would help on. This approach incorporates the interpretations that we've been looking for. So option 4 basically says, forget all of these interpretations, let's simplify the code. Option 5 says, let's incorporate those interpretations, stick with the original intent, and make it clearer. You know, it's kind of an either or, and this is obviously a policy one because I'm not sure how to present this at the public hearing. I can present all of these 5 options. I would recommend going with options 4 or 5, maybe both, so they can come before the public to see which one has the more support. So I guess at this point, I'll turn it over to you to discuss or ask questions or.
So what was the original intent?
The original intent was to try and help people design homes that complied with the front and side yard setback planes and the allowed projections. There was confusion. We were having to wrangle with people when they were trying to say this was an allowed, like entire second floors. They were trying to say that those were dormers, and they're not. They were second floors. It's really, the point of this is that you can have whatever style house you want under these parameters. So it's not that we're saying that you can't have a dormer that takes up the entire wall plane. You can only do that if you stay under the side yard setback plane. So for larger lots, this is not an issue. For smaller lots, when they're trying to get floor area on second floors and they're trying to project into that setback plane, either on the front or on the sides, this becomes an issue. And it's something that has come up, like I've said, when staff is trying to review building permits. We typically see a couple iterations as people struggle to work through it.
So, but the intent for the setbacks on the second level, it has a reason for it, doesn't it?
Correct, yes,
Does
it's
this-
reduced massing.
Do you think that 5 meets that reason?
4 and 5, both. So we're not trying to change the intent of that reduced massing on second floors. 4 allows it to go beyond dormers and gable ends. It basically just says you can have massing that projects as long as you meet certain width requirements. There's always the height requirement as well. 5 basically maintains our existing code practice, which says, no, they're limited to dormers. This is what we mean by dormer. It's a very narrow definition. You have to step it back. You have to step it in. It basically clarifies our current practice.
So which one is easier for the public and for the planners?
I would say option 4 is easier, but again, it comes with the fact that it's loosening the intent of this standard. Because it's not, I think that some of these overlays, they're very clear that they want secondary roof forms. And that's part of the R6 design standards that we're going to be coming back to you later on. They differentiate between primary and secondary roof forms. Now, this standard doesn't apply to R6, and so it's a separate issue. But that same idea of you have a primary roof form, it could be multiple ones, and then you have secondary or decorative roof forms. So I think this standard is trying to, the original intent was to limit it to dormers, really like very traditional dormers. So that's what they envisioned. But it turns out that doesn't work with contemporary homes. People are trying to maximize their floor area. They're coming up with ways around it. We're getting not such good design because they're finding loopholes.
So is 4 more clear and objective, or 5?
I would say they're equal that way. I think with the additional language in option 5, I think we've provided more clarity on how this standard is implemented and what is an allowed projection. But option 4 is definitely easier to implement because you just have to hold up a scale and say, what is the width of whatever this projection is? What is the width of the facade? Check. So it is,
So 4 is a ratio,
4 is just a ratio. It doesn't look at the form.
and 5 is saying that roof dormer has to be enclosed around it with primary roof.
It moves away from the ratio. It keeps the ratio, but it adds in a design element.
I've got 3 commissioner questions in addition to what I just went through. So Commissioner Beckett?
I like number 5. It gives a little more definition. The one thing that you've added back in that had been taken out in one of the photos that you showed earlier, and that's that it has to be the dormer has to be stepped back from the wall plane by a minimum of 1 foot. I would pull out that clause, and the rest of it remains clear.
So you don't think it should be stepped back by the wall plane below by 1 foot?
It should be optional, but not required in the code.
Okay.
My own preference.
Why would you say that that should be optional?
Well, I just looked at the photos that you put up there and some of the dormers that I thought were really attractive, such as the one on the bottom left does not have a setback from the wall on the dormers.
So I would say that, so this option number 5 basically incorporates the first definition of dormer, which does not allow for a wall plane dormer or a wall dormer, which is what you're referring to. These bottom two images include wall planes. So if we were to allow wall plane dormers, that would be definitely a break from our current practice. Again, you can have a wall plane dormer. That's not the issue. The wall plane dormer cannot project into the side yard or front yard setback plane. So just to keep hammering that point home. But if we are going to allow wall dormers, we can't just eliminate that one here. We also have to go to the section before where it says fully enclosed in the roof. Because that would actually, we'd be going to definition number 2, which says it has to be enclosed on at least 3 sides of the roof. That allows for both fully enclosed dormers, like this one in the upper right hand, and it allows for this type of dormer, where it's a wall dormer.
Well, I appreciate that you've thought it through so carefully, and so let's just go with the way you worded it.
Well, I mean, I think that's a very valid option to consider. I mean, I'd be happy for the commission to consider it, to, instead of going with a really strict definition of dormer, to go with the more moderate version of dormer, or definition of dormer.
So,
And of course, I just have to, this is what should be in the draft. for
Yes.
Right, so this would be
public
option number 6.
yeah, we're not voting, we're just talking about what we think. And Commissioner Ward?
Well, just to kind of back up for me anyway, this is a discussion about allowable projections beyond the front and side yard setback planes.
Correct.
And so we're just trying to figure out how great shall be the level of exception.
Correct.
And the,
And what design that projection will have.
yeah, so you might recall during the infill discussions that the allowance of projections like this at all is beneficial in having architectural detailing
Flexibility.
and articulation, and not just having, you know, a shoebox maximizing the envelope. So there is some benefit, you know, in appearance of the homes and have.
Sure,
allowing the-
oh, absolutely. I mean, that kind of detailing really can be very additive to, you know, design desirability. It's just up to us to figure out how to word how the exception shall be allowed.
So option number 4 definitely is the most flexible version of that. It leaves it up to the property owner, the designer, the architect, whatever, to figure out how they want to use that projection, what sort of building form they want to put there.
Commissioner Papay?
Seems as though option 4 deviates from what the intent of this was meant.
It's
it's hard for
definitely,
me to-
it makes it much more flexible than,
It's hard for me to wrap my head around why we would be discussing or trying to navigate into, incorporate that when it's significantly deviating away from the intent of what this discussion was meant for.
so, I mean, this regulation was adopted first in 2008, actually. The front setback plane was adopted in 2003. Side yard setback plane was adopted in 2008. They have morphed. There's some standards, some overlay districts like the Evergreen and Uplands that have come up with their own versions of it. It's not without, it hasn't stayed in its original version. And like I said, the way it was originally written, we have had to use a lot of interpretations to get there. So I think clarifying it is necessary. I don't think the dormer definitions get there. I think options 4 or 5 clarify it.
Would agree with that.
Yeah, and I think that these aren't set in stone. These are, living, breathing standards. And so I don't know that the infill task force will be offended that we're coming back and looking at these again. Because we want to, after years go by and we see how they've been implemented and where the sticking points are. But you're right, option 4 definitely makes it, I'm not gonna say much more flexible, but it makes it more flexible. I think it'll depend on the design and the architect or the property owner to see how far they go.
Can you go back a couple of slides to thank you, right here. In looking at 5, and excuse my ignorance on this, it says, for the purpose of this standard, a projecting dorm or dormers must be fully enclosed in the roof form. Are all of these considered fully enclosed in the
No.
roof form?
No, sorry, so I had limited space on this slide. These top 3 are,
So the top 3 are considered fully enclosed in the roof, okay?
Yes.
Because they're not on the side,
they do, the plane of the face of the dormer, so this would be the
roof.
face of the dormer.
so they're set back from the roof
Exactly,
edge, okay.
exactly.
Thank you for the wall.
Really.
And then it says, all portions of a compliant dormer may project.
Yes. So again, that's getting to an interpretation that I can kill you with detail. Basically,
I'd rather not.
there's a difference between dormers and gable ends, which
Okay,
is basic,
sure.
that's what it's trying to
Okay.
get to.
And Commissioner Fisher.
I'm just curious, who set the intent? When you talk about the intent of these rules,
Yeah.
who made the intent? Was it some grand design who said this is what the city should look like?
So the infill task force were made up of designers, architects, neighborhood activists, all sorts of people. Bill, were you on it? Both rounds?
I was on number 1, not 2.
Sorry, Commissioner Ward. You were on the first round in 2003. Well, it took a number of years. So I would say, one of the ones we're going to be talking about in a moment, side yard setback planes on steeply sloped lots. That was part of infill round 2. And when I was trying to talk to people about it and trying to figure out, why it ended up the way it did, I got 2 different opinions. Well, I had 2 memories of it. One was very vague, one was very specific. These standards were created by interested people who participated in the infill task force, and they were pulled from various parts of the community.
And they were
So-
reviewed by the planning commission at the time.
Yes, and
Yeah.
Because
adopted by
I was
city
going to say,
council.
as a planning commission, do we have the right to change the intent? So like number 4 would effectively allow changing that intent. So
Well,
as
yes, I
as the
think-
commission, are we
Yes.
allowed even to consider that?
I think that there's nothing legally stopping you from considering it. If you think that it's something that is not in keeping with the infill task force goals, then I would say you don't direct me to move forward with option 4.
Well, ultimately, the comprehensive plan is the guide for this. So in the policies that would be addressed in bringing this forward to you in a hearing, we would reflect on the goal 10, the housing goals and policies for the city, and the more aesthetic aspirations that are in the comp plan for good design. And it's a balance, as you know, between providing flexibility for homeowners and for builders to, provide needed housing in the community with the neighborhood preservation or neighborhood compatibility goals and policies in the comp plan. So I think, all of that, you're the policy advisors of the city council on this. We just want to make sure that if you're going to make a policy recommendation that's a shift away from the original intent 15 years ago, as Johanna's described it, that you're doing that intentionally and the city council is aware. I think, in my opinion, that, option 4 isn't really contrary to the intent. I think it's not as prescriptive, and depending on where you establish that limit on the width of the projection relative to the width of the facade is where potentially movement away from the original intent would occur. So I think that's really calibrating it is important if you were to go with option 4. Option 5 is, I think, the more conservative approach, and in that it's relating to dormers, which the original intent, I think, was to allow encroachments that were dormers or gable ends. So I think that's, you can still find that it's consistent with the intent, but how you calibrate that standard will be important and through the hearing process.
So you're looking for direction from us as to whether to include 4 and 5, or 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5?
I would, I don't think that the options 1 through 3, the definitions of dormer, I don't think they give us any solutions. So I put them in there because that's where we started, and I think it's a good place to understand where the direction of the discussion went, the direction the discussion went. I would focus on 4 and 5, and I would leave it to the commission to tell me, do you want both of them brought forward with more explanation, going through the comp plan to see, which one is more balanced with the comprehensive plan policies, or do you want to choose one to move forward for the council's consideration?
I would be interested in seeing the input from the community on 4 and 5, both.
Okay.
Because I think there's significant reasons to pick one over the other. That's just the way I feel about it. Commissioner Pape?
Based on Chair Baker's comment there, I would say the same. I was leaning more towards just 5, but torn because this side dormer, wall dormer,
Wall dormer.
Wall plane.
wall dormer
Yeah, sorry.
is, it's an interesting option that provides some architectural intrigue and distinction from other homes hopefully on the street or in the area, but 5 really precludes that.
I can give a sub-option, so option 5A and B, one using the very constrictive, I mean, not to make it more complicated.
You're going to confuse everybody now.
That's my
All of a sudden,
goal.
we've got a scroll that's now developed for.
But I think if we're down to 2,
But
we
if we're
can have
down to
option
2 and it's
4, which is
4 and
really
5,
flexible, and
I
then.
think out of that, the
Okay.
public input, or the feedback on that.
Sure, I can explain, that this option 5 is pretty strict. There's the possibility of loosening it up to allow wall planes, and this is what it'd look like.
We probably ought to be really clear about where this standard, which zones or overlays this standard applies, and where the overlay would supersede it, because I think some of the issues or problems that have been identified over the years, as you were saying, on the smaller lots, this wouldn't even apply, like first edition R6, right? So
Yeah, it has its own standards.
we want to make sure people are, if they have testimony, that they're addressing it to the standards that actually apply.
And Commissioner Beckett?
After listening to all this and going back and forth, I would strongly recommend that we go with 5. 4 is just too loose. 5 is much better in terms of getting direction, but let's cut out that phrase about steps back from the wall plane. So in other words, let's allow the wall plane dormer. But other than that, stick with what you've got here for 5.
So is there a consensus with the
I would agree with that.
commission to go with both or with one, let's say? First, is it a decision to go with both of them?
When you say go with, I'm going to start
To
pushing.
present to the public both choices of options 4 and 5. Thank you very much.
I like having the public look at both of them.
Okay, and you're sticking with 4, 5?
I'll go with 5.
I'm for both, and you're,
I'm good with both, to look further at those 2 options.
okay?
I'm good with 5 if we removed the 1-foot setback, so you could allow for the.
Okay.
So it's a
It sounds like 5 is the
4-2,
direction.
we favor going with both of them.
Okay.
We can't lose by having 5 included.
Okay, sounds good. I'll do that.
I'd
Thank
be
you.
interested to see how you present that.
Well, it'll look very similar, except none of the dormer definitions will be there, so simpler that way. But then I'll kind of wrangle option 5 a little bit and clean up all of this, so hopefully, I mean, the rest of this stuff is pretty simple. I'm just sort of looking through here, there's other strike-throughs and things, but I'm just trying to rearrange the language to be a little bit more readable, so.
Thank you.
But please give the public pictures of both options so they know what the heck they're talking about.
Absolutely.
The words don't do it by themselves.
Okay, sounds
I
good.
think it's also important to point out that they're both clear and objective.
Yes.
It's not when you say flexible that I get lots of choices and I can choose it myself or not. It's really written here and everybody can
Yeah,
decide.
one is very quantitative, and then one has quantitative plus a design aspect
go.
to it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for your input.
Any other questions or comments? Let's move on to 19.
Okay, so hopefully this one is a little simpler. This is, again, one I took before the Builders Advisory Group because there were people on the infill task force in that group. I also reached out to a couple of people in the first edition Forest Hills Neighborhood Association that were at least, I think they were on the task force, if not, no, Jim Bolland was on the task force, and he's, been active in helping guide the city's structure design standards. But basically, the question that I posed in this amendment is, why are steeply downslope lots not exempt from the side yard setback plane? And so when I talked to the infill task force members, one person didn't remember why it was not included, since steeply upslope lots are. One person said, well, it was a coup and we were overruled and all sorts of rumor mongering, and so I thought, well, that's not very helpful either. So basically, there was no clear reason why on steeply sloped lots, only upslope lots were exempt from compliance with this standard. So when I brought this to the commission in July, you said, please provide some examples of up and down sloped lots, steeply up and down sloped lots. So what I did in the memo was I included some upslope lots, and these are two images of compliant homes on upslope lots. The top two photographs there, those are taken from the street level looking up. So just take that into consideration when you're looking at that. And then the image down below is a steeply downslope lot. And this is, in the memo, I also have a picture of it under construction, but this graphic shows it much better, because it was surrounded by scaffolding out in the field. But basically, this is a steeply downslope lot that was approved with grid review design variances to exceed the side yard setback plane. And then also in the memo, we had images of downslope lots, steeply downslope lots with houses that complied. And you could see that in the memo. They're very complex wall planes, very complex roof forms. You have a comment from the Home Builders Association. There was a representative at my Builders Advisory Group on that one, and everyone in that Builders Advisory Group was adamant that steeply downslope lots come with so many challenges. Exempting them from compliance with the side yard setback plane is just a no-brainer from their end. It's a no-brainer as far as being able to get a design through the process easier, but then also a design that was more energy efficient, fewer corners and roof angles and little, what do they call those, little roof gullies, roosters? No. What do you call those? Anyway, but the little crickets. Crickets, there we go. Roosters, crickets. But the Builders Advisory Group was adamant that in the extreme scenario of a steeply sloped lot, and that is a 25% grade change between the front property line and the most distant part of the structure, that it should absolutely be exempt, the same as upslope lots. The massing impacts are actually less prominent on downslope lots because the increased massing is hidden below the street level. You have the same impact on neighbors either way, but as you can see from these code-compliant upslope lots here, all of that massing is exposed. They do have slightly different front yard setback plane standards when you have a steeply upslope lot, but that's still a lot of massing that's visible. And I'm not saying that's a problem. I'm just saying that if more massing is the issue, then steeply downslope lots, you have the scenario of it being hidden below the street. So my recommendation is to exempt it, to include steeply downslope lots, but of course, this is a policy discussion, so I'm happy to hear anything the commission has to say on that and to take your direction.
Commissioner Fisher?
How many lots are we talking about? Is this going to open up the bottle? And if you say, okay, now we've exempted downsloping lots, and now builders rush in and they say, oh, look at all those lots that we could have developed.
I really don't think so. It's really hard to measure or to figure out how many steeply sloped lots there are. It's also, because it's a measurement between your front property line and the most distant part of the structure, it's something that could change. It's based on building design. So if I could look and try to figure out, what I did look is I basically saw that there are neighborhoods like McVeigh South Shore where it looks like there are the possibility of a number of lots being steeply downsloped lots. As far as developers rushing in because suddenly it's now easy to design a home, especially in the McVeigh South Shore neighborhood, that is not the case. A lot of those lots are substandard. They have street side setbacks, along with internal side setbacks, front and rear that are all R75, even though they're substandard lots. You have all the other structure design standards like the side yard appearance and screening, the long wall plane standards, the maximum height. All of these will help regulate massing. And it's not, I would say, developers are of the opinion that it is not easy to design in the city in compliance with our zone and structure design standards. This takes out one regulation for an extreme scenario, and I don't think it makes it all that much easier to custom design a home. I think it takes out a really hard one that we've seen multiple iterations coming in on building permits and really complicated floor plans and roof plans as a result.
And I think part of what makes it challenging for designers and the city is that the way that we measure height, and you might want to, if we haven't already discussed that, it's really 1,000 points of height all the way down the hill or all the way up the hill, and you can describe it better than I can.
Right, so, yeah, I mean, maximum height is still gonna stay in place, and that the maximum height follows the slope of the lot. And so you're already having a house that steps down. There are some roof form projections, but it's pretty limited. So the house is already gonna step down. This side yard plane means it has to also step in. So you have in the memo, the two on Westlake Drive that I included in here. It's hard because the photos don't really do it justice, but if you looked at the floor plans, you have the main floor plan and then you have the second floor plan, and it is a striking difference because it's so steeply sloped that setback plane pushes that massing down immediately. But it's still, you would still get some of that. You would still have it step down because of the maximum height, the way we measure height in the city.
Commissioner Pape?
In essence, we're just treating upslope the same as downslope.
We're treating downslope the same as upslope. Yes. Right now, upslope is exempt, and it's a technicality, but
Sorry about that.
I have to correct it. So now upslope is exempt, and we're adding on downslope.
Okay.
Commissioner Ward?
I'm inclined to think that this is okay because I can imagine how difficult it would be to design with the sloping side yard setback. I have never built on a steep lot. I've been fortunate enough to not face that challenge. But I'm inclined to think that downsloped lots should be exempted also.
Anybody on the commission think we're going in the wrong direction? Let's move on to 20.
Okay, thank you. So now we're on page 29 of attachment A. This is, I'm including this as a policy one, but it's really just getting at the legislative intent, especially for the clear and objective standards. But it does, because the code is not clearly written, it is making the code more,
Clear.
it's making it clearer, but it's narrowing it down, more restrictive.
But is it objective?
So basically, the clear and objective building design standards apply for mixed-use projects in Westlake Grove. There's a direct reference. You have the choice in Westlake Grove if you have mixed use or residential to go with the discretionary standards or the clear and objective standards. So I had a project that was mixed use, and when they got to this 60% fenestration requirement, they said, well, it's a linear measurement, therefore we can use clear stories way high up on the wall plane to meet that requirement. And I thought, that can't be right. So I looked at the legislative intent, and I'm repeating myself from the first work session, but bear with me. looked at the legislative intent, and it definitely was for storefront windows. So what I'm proposing here is basically the same language that is from the downtown and the Lake Grove Village Center overlay. Basically saying it's not just windows, but storefront windows, and it's 60% of the street-facing facade, not the length of, and then it has a minimum and maximum sill height for where those windows abut the sidewalk surface. So that's my proposal for the clear and objective standards. And then building on that, I wanted to just make sure we had as consistent language as possible regarding this regulation throughout the code. And so looking back to the downtown and the LGC overlay districts, taking out linear measurement in both of those and adding in the word facade. So again, we're talking about square footage on a facade. It's not changing the percentage that's required. In downtown, it's 80%. In LGBC, it's 65%. Clear and objective standards, it's 60%. So there's differences in how it's implemented as far as how much fenestration. But I wanted the language to be as consistent as possible. Any questions on that one? Any discussions?
I don't know if we all understand it, but we all agree with it.
We want windows, and they have
Thank
to
you.
be big. Okay, so moving on to item 21. This one, and Planning Director Siegel can help me out on this one, because this is something that I think he was dealing with as far as a very unhappy person trying to get through the building permit process, and came across a major stumbling block when they were required to comply with, I believe it was fire code as far as access from a basement. They had to put in a secondary door, which meant they had to dig out, which meant they increased the building height, and all of a sudden they were in design review, which we shoved through as fast as possible, but they were pretty unhappy. And so Planning Director Siegel directed staff to look at possibly exempting under very specific limitations, certain very specific parameters, certain types of modifications necessary to bring a building into compliance with building and fire codes. And that's what we've proposed here. There is never going to be a way to 100% catch every single possibility. So by adding in this exemption, you know, there might be something that has a bit more impact than we intended, but I think that the risk is, I think staff believes that the risk is fairly minimal, and that the benefit of helping get our basically our commercial districts getting facade updates and tenant changes, tenant improvements done in the most efficient way possible is overrules that possible risk. So I'm not sure if you have any questions about that, or.
I think you got a pass.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so this is my last one. This is a two-parter again. The first part, I think, is again a no-brainer. This deals with the code sections that regulate when a permit expires. And again, we're talking about a land use application approval. So right now, there's two code sections that deal with expirations. There's one under our review procedures, and then there's a section under our conditional use standards. So what the first part of this amendment does is it consolidates expiration, abandonment, extension, all of that under, well, not forget abandonment, expiration and extensions under one code section under the review procedures. And so that's this first, the first part of this. The second part of it is when you look at the conditional use standards, there is this exemption in place for major public facilities. So for example, if, using a recent example, the Lake Ridge High School stadium cover, in 2014, they went through a whole public process to get the grandstand stadium expanded and covered with a press box and a separate little concession stand. And unfortunately, at the time, they didn't have sufficient funding to move forward with it. And it came back around this last year. And then when I was going through, that was one of my projects, when I was going through the analysis, I thought, oh, that's interesting. The DR portion of this project, because it was both a development review permit and a conditional use modification, because they were increasing the intensity, the possible intensity of the use on the site by putting more seats there. They were converting temporary to permanent seats, and they were putting covers over those seats. So they increased the potential of more people coming to more events. And so we treated it as a conditional use modification. The DR portion of that 2014 approval lapsed after 3 years because nothing was constructed. But the CUP modification portion still held in place. And so I had this interesting scenario where I brought to the DRC a development review permit application for their review. And I said, basically ignore the conditional use part of it. It is still valid. All of the review that we did to measure possible impacts from the increased seating has been done. Nothing has changed in the meantime. Actually, the amount of seats under the cover have been reduced. So this proposal has less impacts. So the second part of this amendment is what we're looking at is, do we want to continue that practice where if you have a two-part land use approval, part DR permit, part CUP, do we want to continue exempting the CUP, or do we possibly want to exempt the DR portion of it as well? Which would mean that the Lake Ridge High School stadium cover, that would be effective, and they could move into building permit in substantial compliance with that approval whenever. It would never expire. So those are the options we're looking at. Right now, the DR permit would expire after 3 years, but the CUP portion wouldn't. Do we want to continue that practice for major public facility improvements? Or do we want to say both the DR portion and the CUP portion are exempt from that three-year deadline? And what I've put in the memo is a recommendation to look at exempting major public facility projects from both the DR and CUP deadline, the 3-year deadline, simply because these are projects that go through substantial public review and engagement. They're typically done for or by the city of Lake Oswego or the school district, which means a lot of outreach, a lot of public process before that's over and above what a typical land use application would have. There's the public funding component of it where it does take, if you're talking about public monies, you do have to generate that. You have to convince the public to use the money that way or to even raise the money that way through, say, a school bond. So when you make them like this Lake Ridge High School, they did all of the work. They put all of the money into a land use application in 2014, and basically that just went kaput. Half of it went kaput. They had to come back and reinvest all of that money in updated plans and updated analysis and go through the whole review process again. Now, the CUP portion they got to leave alone. We didn't realize that at the time, so they actually ended up doing that again as well. But it's a matter of the best use of public monies. So again, that's why staff is recommending that major public projects be exempt from DR and CUP expiration. The follow-up to that is a lot of these school improvement projects are considered minor public facility improvements, meaning it's not a CUP, and they are subject to a 3-year deadline. So we're talking about major projects here, like big school remodels, big school additions that would be exempt.
Commissioner Fisher?
I'm curious as to why DRs expire after 3 years. Is it fair to assume that it's because the code may change?
Yes.
All right. Doesn't that also apply to public facilities?
It would. And so, I mean, that's the balancing act, right? So again, the amount of effort that goes into designing a major public facility project, that takes a while. Getting the funding takes a while. And so you could be out of sync with current code. It could change over that time. And that's part of the risk of exempting them. But you also need to remember that if they have a land use approval, they have to stay in substantial compliance to that approval when it comes time for the building permit. If they change from it and deviate from it in any sort of substantial way, or even in a series of minor ways that end up, being a substantial modification, they have to go back through the review again. So
And from a fire, life safety, or building structural safety perspective, that's a separate permit process. And so the building codes that are in effect at the time that they apply to get their building permit, those are the standards that apply. So even though you might have a site plan and some schematics, some preliminary design perhaps for one of these school or city projects, it's not until we apply for a building permit do we apply the building codes and those standards that are in effect. So those may be changing as we're going along and we have to comply with the current standards.
And I would say that, to build on that, while the fire, life, and safety and building codes do get updated, and will, any DR permit, any major public facility would have to comply with current codes there. The design standards, the PF or PNA zone standards, those don't change very often. So as far as the risk of not being in compliance with code, say if it takes you 4 years or 5 years to get the funding in place to move forward with the project, I think it's fairly minimal as far as what your approved design was from 2014 to what got approved in 2019. I can tell you for that specific example, the Lake Ridge High School, there wasn't any difference in code as far as structure design and things like that. And so
Commissioner.
dimensional standards.
You get your
No, I was thinking in terms, like just before you were talking about if the fire code changes and you have to do a new egress, if the fire code changes about stadiums, that you have to have more exits or something. Is there some hybrid you could do that's short of a full review,
Yeah.
but yet complies with the latest code?
For
Yeah, I
what?
mean-
Are you talking about aesthetic and
No,
zoning,
no, no, let's say,
landscaping, or build?
let's say the standard for fire exiting in a stadium, you have to have more exits, let's say, between the time, let's say they were approved, and then the fire department realizes that, oh, we need more exits. Do they have to go through a whole developmental review? No.
That
And
ties
so,
in with-
Yeah, so that's getting to that idea of substantially similar to your approved design. You know, I've been working on a lot of big projects like the Mercantile or Springs Living, and Mercantile especially. They've been coming around every couple of months or so and bringing a list of modifications that they want to incorporate into the building permit. They just want me to rubber stamp them. And we sit down and we have a couple hours long process of what we could actually approve that's in substantial compliance. And so that's just something, I can't tell you black and white, absolutely, these will always be substantial compliance. We look at it in a case-by-case scenario. We look at what the actual change is. We bring them to the staff meeting and we say, okay, staff, what do you think? Does this window look substantially similar to this window? Does the change impact sightlines, privacy, you know, the overall intent of the architectural style, things like that?
But we've also recommended in the prior code item 21 that if a change is required to comply with building or fire codes and it meets these criteria, notwithstanding the fact that it's substantially different than what was approved through the development review process, it may be exempt. So we're trying to kind of walk that divide or walk that line
Yeah.
to accommodate the changes that may be required over time.
So that is why staff is recommending that they be exempt. In the consolidated standard that's left under LOC 50.07.003.17, that basically, or for permits associated with a major public facility, so that those are exempt from that 3-year deadline.
Commissioner Pape.
Don't know that I can get behind having it be indefinite.
Okay.
I don't know that I could agree that, or I think I could agree that maybe 3 years might not be enough time for them to secure the funding. Whether that's 4 years or 5 years. There is a time frame for private. You have to abide by that.
Yes.
And if you don't have the funding, whatever expense you put forth to put through and try and build your development, that's a cost of doing business. On the public sector, really need to have in the same way, maybe a little bit more elasticity on it, but have your ducks in a row before coming forward and putting forth a project. And if you can't do it within 3 years, maybe you really ought to reevaluate that project.
So you would recommend for permits associated with a major public facility shall expire in 5 years or something like that?
Again, I don't know what that,
You don't know what that
I
actual
don't know what that
deadline would
timeframe
be?
is, but I know that I couldn't in favor of being in perpetuity.
So is the issue with the DR portion of it, or, like, so the current practice is the DR expires, but the CUP would not?
Well, the CUP has an expiration of when, or is that in perpetuity?
No, that's been taken out. Yeah, the CUP is, right now, it's still, the CUP, the conditional use standards, a conditional use permit expires within 3 years, just like standard, a DR permit. The exception is CUPs associated with major public facilities. So we
Right, so
can,
with a major public facility, we're talking about here, there is no,
CUP expiration. There's
Right.
not right now. So the choice is we can continue that practice, and a major public facility that has a DR and a CUP, the DR would expire after 3 years, the CUP wouldn't, so they'd have to come back around and re-examine that development review permit under the current
and so
standards.
because there isn't the expiration of the CUP, we can't marry those two up unless it's indefinite.
No, I think that there's that third option, that you can continue the current practice. Well, that's actually 4. You can make all permits subject to the 3-year deadline, regardless. You can do the current practice of exempting the major public facility CUP portion from the deadline. You could exempt the major public facility, any portion of any permit associated with that exempt, or you could make them subject to a different deadline.
When was the example that we're talking about, the Lake Ridge Stadium, when was that originally submitted?
Either late 2013 or early 2014. I'll say 2014. The approval is
So
for
5-6 years ago.
Yes, it was 5 years ago.
So other examples of projects, the school bond is a 3-year plan, and the school district's intending to go out for 2 more after that if they stick with their facilities plan. The city has plans for 2 parks, Woodmont Park and Iron Mountain Park, that Iron Mountain Park has gone through the development review process and has approval, although the funding or the timing of, and it has funding too, but the timing of the project is uncertain at this point. So, I mean, there are actual projects that are in the pipeline that could be hanging in the balance if we were to go one way or the other. So just, and I think the staff proposal for the public hearing is to exempt that development review expiration for public facilities. If there are other options that the commission would like us to explore or to bring forward, that's really what we're here to discuss.
Yeah.
And you'll vote, you'll have an opportunity to hear from the public as well.
That's my 2 cents. I can't.
Okay. So you.
Commissioner Warren?
Sorry.
I'm with Commissioner Pepe. I don't think that things should be, that the door should be left open forever.
Okay.
There's so many changes that could occur in a community over a period of a few years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, that I would just be uncomfortable leaving it wide open. Now, perhaps we should look at other options, a longer span of allowing the conditional use to remain intact.
Okay.
4 years, 5 years, but I don't think it should be left wide open.
Okay.
I think too many other changes could occur around town, around the community, that would not be a good idea.
Would you, so I'm happy to come forward with that option. Would you want the options to be either fully exempt or fully comply, but with a longer option? Do you still want there to be a split between the DR and CUP portion of it? That's my fundamental question right there. Should there be, should one of them expire and the other not, or should both expire?
What would be the true benefit of allowing one to expire and one not?
I don't see a clear reason for the distinction, honestly. I
And
think,
that's why I would recommend that they,
I see a distinction,
Oh,
if you
okay,
don't
great.
mind.
Yeah,
So the
absolutely.
conditional use is about the use, right? It's not, it could just be the development program. We need seating for 3,000 fans. We need an infield practice area. We need this general program or list of facilities. And that need may be known and it may be fairly constant over time. The design of the facility is what could change depending on, funding, depending on, and I think your point's well taken, Commissioner Pape. The sentiment in the community, the surrounding neighborhood could be changing, and so if there are changes in the development code or just changes that would impact the development decision one way or another, that might be a rationale for having a cutoff point. But I think that, I think from administering the code, having one expire and the others not expiring is confusing.
I think that's what I'm trying to say. Yeah, that seems wonky.
It's awkward.
I'd
But-
marry them
I
up.
can just also,
I'm not so sure.
I'm sorry, just frequently, I mean, like the school district is our poster child on this. They would come with a conditional use permit for a school that would accommodate, let's say, 1,000 students. They wouldn't necessarily put 1,000 students in there in year one. I mean, that's sort of their maximum build-out that they would plan for. They might start with 500 students, but they also probably wouldn't want to cite a school that they couldn't get 1,000 students in, if they only asked for 500, and then, 10 years later, they can't justify 1,000. They might say, well, we never really wanted to, we would not have wanted that site in the first place then. They need to know what they can anticipate for and what they can be authorized for in a impacts base to cite their facility.
That's a really good point. The city needs to know ultimately, or would like to know ultimately, what the capacity is for this site, because it may trigger some transportation improvements. And depending on how their site is built out over time, those improvements may be required at certain points along the way.
Yeah, to me, it's kind of akin to an ODPS,
Right.
overall development and
Plan and schedule.
build. Mary's Woods, Merrill Hurst, the whole Mary's down there, they had a 25-year ODPS, ultimately. They built a little bit, but they needed assurance that they could build all their component parts eventually, but they didn't want to jump it all within 3 years.
Well, so wouldn't that then come in where it's been stricken out under 5? Conditional use permit shall be void after 3 years if 15% of the structural construction has not occurred. So if you have this massive overall plan or a school and you've built 20% of it, then it's still in effect, is it not?
That's correct. So if you were to do, let's say, the junior high that just got approved, not Waluga, Lake
Oswego Junior High?
Oswego Junior High.
Lake
The
Ridge.
Lake Ridge Junior High, the big one, the fully
yeah.
redeveloped one. So they got approval, DR and CUP approval to build the entire school. Now, moving forward, if they run into funding problems and construction slows because of construction costs, whatever, and they're only able to build 2/3 of the school, there's some sort of logical divide, and like they leave this component off, they build 2/3 of that school, the CUP will never expire. They don't ever have to go back and reevaluate the impacts on the neighborhood for that full school. They may have to come back and evaluate that design for the rest of that project if they don't get it constructed. Well, actually, no, in that case, it would get them past the 15%. So that's not the greatest example, but basically, right now, major public improvements that have to go through a DR and CUP, there's some certainty there, the way that the code is written. The way that we're proposing to implement it is it gives them more certainty. It doesn't subject them to a deadline. But I hear your points absolutely, that maybe that's not the best way to go, that they should have some flexibility, but more than a private project, because public funding is always, it has different complications than private funding. Both of them come with their own challenges. But, so maybe the deadline should be a little bit longer for public improvement, for major public facilities. And I'm happy to throw that in there. If you want to just go that direction, I can offer it in as an option for the public to consider. We definitely let the school district know on this one, where we're going to go, so we can get their opinion if they want to offer one.
So before we go there, Commissioner Beckett has a question.
Well, I would go along with what you just said about lengthening the time period, 5 years. If they can't get their act together within 5 years, then it's a whole different problem. Is there a way to do that applied only to major projects, not to smaller projects? Or does that just make it too complicated to have two different standards?
Well,
Well, this is only
What's
major
the
anyway.
criteria for it being major?
so major public facility is defined. And then minor public facilities are small changes. Minor public facility is a kind of a different animal. They're small changes to an existing major public facility, or they're smaller projects just in general. So I think that the way that the
Let's
code.
do the 5 years for a major project. What I don't like written here is this thing, conditional use pursuant to a conditional permit is discontinued after a period of at least 1 year. Any further use of the property shall conform to this code, and it goes on to the city manager then in writing, and that's just a 1-year hassle to go through. So let's go to a longer period, the 5 years for the major projects.
Okay, so that section that you talked about with the conditional use standards, that's an abandonment of a conditional use, and that's the actual use itself. And we're not proposing any changes to that. The conditional use permit is the land use approval that gets you your conditional use. The conditional use is the use of the building or facility, whatever it is. So I think that needs to, I don't think that there's any direction from the community or from staff to change that part of it. Once you get your conditional use, you have to keep it going, and if it's abandoned for more than a year, sorry, you're gonna need to go, it's now gone. But definitely, I'm happy to, do you want me to just present that one option of the extended deadline, or both options, the waiver or the extended deadline?
Extended deadline.
So it's, a major public facility would expire in 5 years instead of 3? Do you want me to present just that option, or it would expire in 5 years instead of 3, or?
Just so it expires at some time.
Okay, that's your direction, is forget the fully exempt, go with a longer expiration date.
Before I can answer that,
Yes.
can you remind me or refresh the memory of definition of major?
Yes, so that's actually in the staff report on,
Before I dig into it, I didn't know if you had it off the top of your head.
I can read it. So no, I don't have it off the top of my head. So it's on page 10 of the staff report or the staff memo. Major public facility is defined by code as, and sorry, it's a long one, any public service improvement or structure developed by or for a public agency that is not defined as a minor public facility. Major public facility, paraphrasing, this use includes but is not limited to utility substations, treatment plants, reservoirs, and above-ground trunk lines for sewer, water, or storm drainage systems, public schools, parks, libraries, fire stations, community centers, police stations, city administrative or other city office buildings, and city motor pool or maintenance buildings.
So if you're remodeling or adding to an existing public structure, that's minor.
Correct.
But if you're building,
Caveat, mostly, yes, that's.
yes,
it
I
would be
understand,
processed.
nothing's hard there. But if you're building something, then that's probably a major.
Correct. And unfortunately, it gets even more complicated. In certain zones,
Yeah.
major public facilities are outright permitted, in other ones, they're
Places,
conditional
all
uses, so.
Is there a cost difference between a DR and a CUP?
Yes, there's additional application fees. So a conditional use right now, I believe, is $5,600 for a new conditional use. A modification is about half that. That's in addition to a DR fee, which has a base fee plus 37% of the future building permit fee. So those for, say, City Hall, I think it ended up being over $30,000 for the land use application. A small portion of that was for the CUP. There are also additional costs associated with complying or responding to the conditional use standards, generating the necessary technical information like, say, a traffic impact study or some sort of functional characteristics analysis, parking studies, getting agreements, like the Lake Ridge Grandstand Stadium. It wasn't with this application, but with an earlier one that they had to reach out to the community and figure out how to manage parking impacts, and worked with the city and a nearby church to.
Well, if I'm a public agency or organization, am I more concerned about a DR application or a CUP application?
That is impossible to answer, unfortunately, because I think that it really depends. Like, for school facilities, you're typically surrounded by residential areas. I think neighbors can be concerned about traffic impacts, but sometimes it's set up in a way that there's not. They're accessing from an arterial road. There's plenty of capacity on that road. Sometimes they're coming off of local streets, and so people would look at more impacts to their homes that way. I think it's just so site-specific and use-specific, it'd be impossible to answer that question.
So my background says that a CUP is more challenging to an applicant than a DR is.
I think there are very discretionary standards there. You have to say, one of them is the functional characteristics can be made to be reasonably compatible with the surrounding uses in the vicinity. That's big. And there are plenty of ways to say that obviously it isn't reasonably compatible, and there's plenty of ways to say that it is. And so you'll have lots of dueling perspectives there.
Okay.
But I think that some of our development standards, people would say, are hard to deal with too, so.
So have we given you any idea where to go?
Yes, I'm going to go with an extended deadline. I think that that's the direction I'm hearing from the commission on that.
Any other comments for somebody?
My recommendation on that would be at least 4, but I wouldn't go past 5.
Okay.
If you're staying within years, then you can break it down to months if you want to.
I would say you already get to 4 under the existing standards. It's 3 years with a 1-year possible
3 years, 1
extension.
year.
So I would say 5 years with a 1-year possible extension to distinguish it a little bit, if that makes sense.
Go 4 with the possibility of a 1, then you get to your 5, and then you're not max, then you're not going past 5 years. To Commissioner Beckett's point, where I'm at is, if you can't get your act together in that amount of time, you gotta look at do something else.
Okay. Would that be the recommendation of the commission, to stick with 4?
Well, we're not voting, but
Well,
Commissioner.
like, what would you like to see as
I'm
far
not
as?
sure about the statement that if they can't get their act together, sometimes it's not their fault.
True.
And so,
Whatever.
is there a way of exempting a public body from a developmental review charge?
No. No. Yeah. I think that would be,
Well, the city manager can adjust,
oh, I'm sorry, for the charge,
Charge,
application
the
fees.
charge.
Yes.
but there
In
are
other words,
criteria for that.
because a city or a municipal facility has challenges that private don't.
I don't think it's the charge that worries people who do these things. I think it has to do with which path you have to go down and when. But that's just my thinking.
Yeah, I think the application fees, while substantial, usually with multi-million-dollar projects, are a drop in the bucket in the end. There is a public process available where if an applicant can show that there's some sort of public benefit from waiving the fee, they can ask that the city manager waive that fee. So that process is there.
So I think we've heard the discussion here, and as Senior Planner Hastay said, we'd like to check in with the school district and the city staff who are responsible for capital projects and see if they have any feedback. But ultimately, we'll have a proposal for you to review in a public hearing, and it's your recommendation to council.
Moving on.
Please.
All right, so now we're at policy item number 23, and that starts on page 11 of the staff report, and
Yeah, I can discuss this. So
Scott will,
this
sorry.
relates to tandem parking. And the city currently allows tandem parking in residential developments where the parking is designated for a resident, and it's for the owner or a tenant. It's also allowed in the Foothills Mixed-Use Zone, which is a zone that is yet to develop, but it's the area, in the Foothills District, and according to the master plan that was developed for that area, it's a very constrained area as far as the geography, and trying to be as efficient as possible with the land that is there, allowing tandem parking, and developments provided that there's an attendant, present to move the vehicle if it's for commercial use. And that's where the tandem parking allowances end in the city. And so we've been looking at this, actually, we were looking at this independently of the Chamber of Commerce and the business community, who are also looking at downtown parking needs for the future. And Actually, the chamber brought this, to our attention, said, have you considered allowing tandem parking for commercial uses that would be, where there would be a parking attendant, where there's valet parking, or for employee parking? So, for example, some of the restaurants in town have tandem parking. They're not meeting a city standard with the parking, but their employees, and I won't name any names, but you've probably, enjoyed their food at some of the restaurants in town, and they have a way of managing it themselves, and it seems to work, well. We don't really get any complaints that I'm aware of from neighbors or from patrons of these businesses that are using shared parking. So we were looking at this and thinking about, with the onset of driver assist vehicles, parking assist, and ultimately, cars that are autonomous. We're not there yet. And also considering, the carbon footprint and the impact that parking has, on the city in an area with limited land supply. And to the extent that we can be more efficient with site planning and, businesses can be responsible for managing their parking, and if, the concept of tandem parking would have to be controlled so that it's not impacting public rights of way, and the parking is accessible without cars having to back out onto a street. That's really what we're interested in pursuing here. And so the standards that are suggested on page 33 would extend tandem parking from the Foothills Mixed Use District to other commercial uses in the city that are, as proposed, would be, hospitality-based or restaurant or assembly spaces where events, the scheduling of events is generally known, or for employees, the parking can be managed in that way. So there are two options that we're considering, and would like your feedback on whether one or the other, or possibly both, should be put forward for public hearing. Option one would allow tandem parking really for these commercial uses in any zone where they're allowed. So it would be for employee parking or for patrons where an attendant is present, and for hotels, restaurants, except drive-through facilities, clubs, lodges, meeting rooms, and other assembly-type spaces, provided that it doesn't require vehicles to back onto the public right-of-way. So that'd be more of a city-wide application in the zones where those uses are allowed. So conceivably, it could be allowed for lodges, or the Mason's Lodge, or an Elks Lodge type of use, or an event center like what we are seeing developed on B Avenue, or a hotel. So obviously this is a change in code that would impact or potentially benefit existing hotels, as well as the hotel or North Anchor project that's envisioned in the downtown. The other option would focus the change on the downtown EC zone, the existing Foothills mixed-use zone, and the Lake Grove Village Center area, but only the general commercial zoning within Lake Grove Village Center. There's also a neighborhood commercial zone in that area that we would not propose extending it to that if you went with option two. So just first off, any feedback on the concept? Are there any questions that you have that you would like to see addressed when this is brought forward in hearing? And secondly, do you have any feedback on the geography?
Commissioner Papay?
Two questions. First, you are identifying, in both of them, an attendant is present to move vehicles. That the front desk individual at the hotel or at the office complex? Or is that an individual in the traditional red shirt, black pants, valet outside?
It's not defined currently in the
Okay,
code.
so that's still kind of up for interpretation or to be worked through?
Yeah, so if
Okay.
an application proposed tandem parking, we would be asking the same questions. And it would likely be different for a hotel than it would for, a restaurant where the employees are managing that themselves, right? So,
Okay.
so that's a good question.
Then the second one, such movement of vehicles does not require backing onto a public right-of-way. Is an alleyway considered a public right-of-way?
An alleyway, yes, it is a public right-of-way.
Okay, so an alley isn't as traveled frequently as, say, Boone's Ferry. I don't know why we would preclude backing into an alleyway where there's not a whole lot of traffic and the potential for an incident, as opposed to a major thoroughfare or a highly traveled road.
Yeah, it's a good point, Commissioner Pape. We do have parking, garage parking along alleys, some alleys that back out
Right.
onto those alleys. This would be, potentially more volume, right? Because it's a,
Don't we already have a regulation of you can't back into an arterial?
parking cannot be configured in a way that it requires backing onto a public street.
No, I mean, I
Private
thought,
on-site parking.
I'm familiar with regulations that say that you cannot back out of a driveway or something like that onto a arterial, either a minor or major arterial,
So
as opposed to local streets.
There's a standard that if you have frontage on something other than a major arterial,
Yeah,
Well,
you have to provide access
If
from
I
that.
if I live in a house on
Yeah,
a street that's a minor arterial, can I back onto that? And I thought that the standards were you couldn't back onto it.
I don't know about that. That would be under the driveway standard? There's proximity of driveways to intersections, and there's
No.
definitely,
All required parking shall be off-street, may not be okay, that's the yard. Okay, it says parking design shall ensure that the parking of any vehicle shall not interfere with the parking maneuvering of any other vehicle. That's not it. So that's a good question, and we'll research that.
Well, I am looking at the driveway standard, 5006-003.
Single-family dwellings or.
Yeah, CO3 sub 2, which deals with driveways. All driveway approaches shall be located and designed so the driver entering or exiting the driveway can see approaching traffic for sufficient distance to make a safe entrance and exit. AASHTO standards shall be used in determining compliance with the standard. So that would apply.
that's site distance, yeah,
Right, that would apply everywhere.
Right.
yeah.
Uh,
I know for commercial projects or any non-residential, we would never approve a parking plan, an open-air parking lot that required someone to back onto a street from that parking lot. I mean, that's just bad design. But for residences onto, like-
The only reason I know that is in the city I was a planner in, that was one of our regulations. You
Was it?
couldn't use arterials or minor arterials to back onto from your residential driveway.
you had to have some sort of turnaround
Had to have some
on-site.
way to turn around and come out forward.
Seems definitely safer,
Seems logical, yeah.
yeah.
Which to me then really points this, I was going on the same understanding, points this to you really can't back onto an alleyway.
Yeah.
Which to me, granted, it could increase the level of traffic on there a little bit, but the access is already there from that commercial use or from a club or a lodge.
Yeah,
church.
it makes sense not to preclude that. That's just, alleys are service. They're public ways, but they're for service.
But the
Commissioner Fisher?
traffic on the alley may make a difference. I mean, some of the alleys in the downtown.
But you're already having
core-
that, more than likely, the traffic's already happening that way to get to that location.
Yeah.
All you're doing now is allowing cars to tandem park, right?
Well,
Yeah.
we'll seek input from the city engineer, and I think, the standard that Evan referenced is really the key.
Which, by the way,
having
I am all in favor of this. I think it's a great idea and working towards finding a solution for it.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Fisher?
I don't know, but is there a regulation as to how much parking is allowed per square foot. And the reason I'm asking is, let's say an owner could half their parking garage, if they're allowed to do this, and then they use the area that they've saved for something else, build a store, or who knows, in that area. Is this giving them more room to develop differently?
Well, yeah, right, I mean, it's a design problem or design opportunity, is to, if you're able to add floor area, because you've got less ground for parking. Now, you've added floor area that has a parking requirement going with it, so you've got to do the calculation. But we use way too much ground for parking for cars. And this is one way to just plan a little bit more efficiently. And over time, as the technology allows, we'll see more use of this kind of parking. But I think, could you get more usable floor area? Yeah, you could, but it wouldn't be one for one.
Commissioner Ward?
I would like to see option 1 as written at the hearing.
Commissioner Beckert?
I was pleased with the statement that it says it also supports, is responsive to changes in technology in the automotive industry, such as driver assist and artificial intelligence. Over a year ago, neighbor across the street from me has 2 Teslas, and their son also has one. The son's driving them to the airport one day, and Kathy's saying, "Oh man, they're talking about making these driverless. I sure wouldn't want to be in one of those." And son turns to her and says, "Mom, I haven't touched the steering wheel since we left your house." So these automated techniques are a lot closer than what we might imagine.
Commissioner Hanson?
I think it's a great idea. I don't think we should limit just one because, as I understand it, number 1 requires a valet be available. And as I see the photograph here, I can see where there's no valet there. That's clearly like a business owner is having the employees kind of park themselves. I think it's a great idea, but I wouldn't limit it to just valet.
Yeah, both options
I
as
think-
written require an attendant, but this is existing language, so there's
Right.
an opportunity to
defined yet.
review that.
I think it's a great idea.
So you're generally leaning towards one? Leaning towards one? The more open one?
Yes.
Did you have any thoughts on this?
So just looking at the 2 options, I would say that 2 is more open because it's any commercial use in the EC and GC zone, LGVC exempt, or sorry, LGVC only in the GC zone. So the option 1 is specific to uses, that limited to those uses. Option 2 is open to the zone.
Oh, I
So
see.
just to clarify for
that's a good
Commissioner
point.
Hanson, I think that she was saying that she liked the more open option, so option 2.
So option 2 is zone-related, and option 1 is use-related.
Correct.
So if you like the more open-ended possibility of uses across all of the commercial zones where those uses are allowed, or just across, these are certain commercial zones. So we could use some feedback on the zones or the geography, as well as how broadly the tandem parking should be allowed in different types of uses.
So I guess I'm confused. If it's a zone, and I have a residential use in that zone, am I allowed then to have the tandem parking in that residential
You already
use?
are.
It's already allowed under A.
So you can, to also clarify, you can have tandem parking. It just doesn't count towards your minimum parking requirement, except in residential zones. So in a residential zone, you can have a certain amount of tandem parking and it counts towards your you get 2 spaces for the tandem parking and it counts towards your minimum parking requirement. If you have to have 20, 4 of them, say, could be tandem. So you could park 4 cars in 2 tandem spaces. That would be fine. In commercial zones, you can't use tandem parking to meet your minimum parking requirement. You can have tandem spaces there, but they don't count towards your minimum parking requirement. Even though you're parking cars there, you still have to meet whatever your minimum parking requirement is. elsewhere. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess I don't understand how this would then help meet the minimum requirement and still reduce the number of spaces.
So it's more, I would say it's not reducing the number of cars on the site, but it is making the use of this parking
I
area
would agree
more
with that.
efficient.
Yeah, I would agree with that, right?
Yeah.
I would agree with number 2, but I wouldn't like, I would rather have what Director Siegel and I were suggesting, and not preclude the use of lightly traveled public ways of an alley or something of that. nature.
Provided the other engineering standards are met, I'm assuming.
Yeah, turn
existing.
ratio and your site distance and whatnot.
So what we can do is we can bring forward a proposal that is allowing one to count tandem parking for, already allowed for residential, so this would add commercial, and it would be across, all zones where commercial uses are allowed. And then I just would like to probe a little bit on the uses. Is it important to the commission that we focus on the types of uses that are listed in option 1? Or, leaving it open then would be, office space, other retail. Not sure how applicable that would be, but certainly for employees, it's helpful.
I'd be in favor of leaving it open.
I'm a church, can I use this?
You can, as it's written, if an attendant is there to move the cars around, so.
And I'm in this case, if I'm in option 2, I have to be in the zone for that.
You would have to be in the zone, and it would only be for, option 2, it's open to any development that's allowed in the zone.
I would say there are not
So-
that many churches in commercial zones.
No, but I was
They're mostly-
thinking other
Commercial's
uses
already
besides
allowed.
what you've mentioned. In
Yeah.
option 1, you mentioned certain types of uses. In option 2, you just said zones. So if I fit into that zone, no matter what my use is, I could use that rule.
Yes.
And with churches already being, quite a few of them in residential zones.
Yeah, but they're not a
already-
residential use.
What's that?
They're not a residential use.
And not a residential use.
Yeah, this really came from the chamber and the staff looking at downtown and Lake Grove, our 2 town centers, where we're really trying to, focus on compact, walkable, mixed-use development. So, the thought was either allow it generally to commercial uses across all zones these uses where they're allowed, or focus, geographically on the downtown and the Lake Grove town centers.
I would like to see it stick with number 1 and it says certain specified uses. That's more restrictive than option 2. But let's start with that, and then 5 years from now, as things progress, then we can always loosen it to a more broader general standard.
So is this a public discussion now? Are we asking the public to come and visit this hearing and say, I like it to be for everybody in these zones, or I like it to be just for these specified uses?
Well, we'd like to put forward a specific proposal for the public to respond to in your hearing. So if you have any feedback on if this should be limited to the downtown and Lake Grove town centers, or should be more broadly applied.
I'd be more in favor of opening it up to those with commercial uses as well. Not necessarily just in specific zones.
Okay, well, I heard, I think a majority of you weighing in initially on option 1, and I think option 1 does that, so.
Can I also
Actually-
reemphasize the need for somebody to be there until we've come to the autumn? I have a Tesla, and I have a function that will operate here. It's called well, whatever, but it automatically parks the car. I could see arguments occurring, right? This is my car, and your car is blocking me. And so I don't want it so that you just have this. I want to have it so that it's controlled in some way. And so I'm urging the commission to make sure that that attendant is included, whichever option. you
Human
pick.
attendant.
And that's the reason for, I think, when we specify hotels, meeting rooms, those are places that might indeed have assistance there to help people park their cars and use the tandem spots without blocking somebody else in.
Yeah, I think it makes the most sense to allow it for employees and for these other uses, where those uses are allowed, provided there's an attendant. Because that's, employees don't need an attendant to move the cars around. But for these other uses, you probably would want to start with that.
So is there a consensus to present both options or one option? Commissioner Hanson? Well, now, this doesn't talk about that. This talks about either it goes in the zones or it goes to the specific uses, both with an attendant.
Well, I like the uses, I'll go with number one because I do like the uses.
You lean towards number one being presented. You lean towards number one being presented?
Good with what?
We have direction. Thanks.
We've got direction, thank you.
So that ends our marathon annual code amendments. Thank you very much for your input.
And it's
I really
not
appreciate
midnight. It's not midnight yet.
it. No,
We do have one or two more items to go on the
So can I-
agenda, but we're almost finished.
just really quickly, make sure that we've got good directions before we finalize for the staff report. I want to say option 18, which is the side yard setback and front yard setback plane. I'm going to come back with options 4 and 5. And 5 is going to have both the restrictive dormer and the slightly more flexible dormer options. Number 22, which is the major public facilities expiration deadline. I'm going to come back with a specific deadline, 4 or 5 years, and maybe we can just hash that out, which one it is at the public hearing. But it's going to be for both the DR and CUP portion of a major public facility permit. And then number 23 with the valet tandem, we're going to go with option 1, adding in an exemption for employees that they don't have to, the use doesn't have to have an attendant if it's for employee parking, like say for restaurant employees or retail employees. And then we'll look at backing into alleys and make sure that that's not an issue per other code standards in the city engineer. Is that correct? And otherwise, as written in the staff report.
Generally, yes.
I was under the impression that under the DR and CUP, that the CUP was going to stay indefinite. It was the DR. that-
Okay,
Am I?
I'm sorry, I guess I didn't understand that. Would you,
Yeah, I thought we were marrying those two up.
well, we're streamlining the code, so expiration deadlines is only dealt with in one section. So I guess we need to revisit that. Do you want it to continue with the DR portion being subject to an expiration deadline, but just a longer one, and the CUP exempt? Or do you want both the DR and CUP portions to be subject to an extended deadline?
I thought we just wanted, I thought we were just going to look at DR for
Okay,
perhaps extending the deadline, but
okay.
not
So the CUP portion will
removing a
continue to be
deadline
exempt
altogether.
from.
And let the CUP remain, because,
Okay.
why make them jump
Thank
through
you.
both giant hoops again?
Okay,
The CUP remains as long as they.
Well, we're not changing it. We're going to leave it with the exemption, yeah.
Yeah, probably use 15%.
No, the
Yes.
CUP was basically exempt from the extension. Doesn't expire in the current rule.
I
We
know,
were just
it's
talking DR is all we were talking about.
clear as mud. But I think now that we've talked about it a little bit more, I'm very clear. You want the CUP, you don't want to have to make them go through the CUP analysis over and over again. That's going to be standard, as long as they're within substantial compliance.
As
of
it
course.
is.
As it is. And then the DR portion, you understand that a little flexibility is probably a good idea. I'll come back with an extended deadline there, not 3 years, maybe 4, maybe 5, and we can figure out what that is.
Right.
Thank you so much.
I
All
think
right.
that's the way we understood it. Okay, thank you very much. That's work session's over. Other business, any other business before the commission tonight? Schedule review,
October 14th, you'll have a set of findings on the zone change that you reviewed, meeting before last. Also have an update on the Historic Preservation Code review, and that'll follow, or what'll follow on the 28th is a work session on citizen involvement guidelines. Public hearing on the annual CDC amendments, November 13th. Followed by a work session on, tentatively at this point, on the first edition code amendments, second meeting in November. And in December, you've got, looks like the only item that's on there is tentative, and that's looking at small cell telecommunication standards. We do have, I forgot to mention on October 14th, the beginning of your discussion about goals and work program. So at that meeting, we'll be asking for some direction on, we'll be bringing a short list of potential work plan items or goals that the staff have identified, and then asking the commission for any that you have in mind, and also then charting a course for public input before you have a joint meeting with the city council in December. That meeting, as you may recall, is to discuss next steps on House Bill 2001. It would also be a good opportunity to check in on, initially on goal setting, because I think House Bill 2001 will be taking up, not an insignificant amount of the Planning Commission's time, probably during the second half of 2020. And we'll want to just check in with the council to see if they have any other items in mind for 2020. So that's pretty much it through the end of the year. That's all we have scheduled.
Is there any possibility that the Planning Commission should do some preliminary work on 2001 before we meet with the council?
I don't think so. No, the briefing that the commission received, I think back in August, perhaps it was, from this David Powell, city attorney, is about as far as we can go with it at this point. The joint meeting with the city council will be an opportunity to get their feedback on the policy issues and where they would like us to spend our time next year. So.
any other questions or comments? This meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.